Tonight, we're breaking down what happened to all 32 Death Eaters that joined Lord Voldemort. This is a topic with a lot to uncover, but I'll keep my narration calm so you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment Night 1. Now back to the video. The Dark Mark. For 2 decades, it was the most feared symbol in the wizarding world, a shimmering emerald skull with a serpent protruding from its mouth like a tongue. When it hung in the sky, it meant death had already arrived. But behind the masks and the heavy black robes were real people, witches and wizards, who chose to cast aside their humanity in exchange for power, blood purity, and the favour of the most dangerous dark wizard of all time. We often talk about Lord Voldemort as a singular force of nature, a monster who acted alone. But the truth is that his reign of terror was built on the backs of a dedicated inner circle. These were the Death Eaters. They were his hands, his eyes, and his executioners. They infiltrated the Ministry of Magic. They corrupted ancient bloodlines, and they turned brother against brother. But what actually happened to them when the green light finally faded and the smoke cleared over the ruins of Hogwarts? The story of the Death Eaters is not just a story of villainy, it is a story of varying fates, ranging from those who remained fanatically loyal to the very end to those who begged for mercy the moment their master fell. There is a common misconception that the Death Eaters were a massive, faceless army. In reality, the true branded followers, those who bore the mark on their left forearms, were a relatively small and elite group. While Voldemort commanded giants, dementors, and snatchers, only his most trusted disciples were permitted to call themselves Death Eaters. Across the First and Second Wizarding Wars, we can identify approximately 32 core members who shaped the history of Great Britain through their service to the Dark Lord. Some of these names are whispered in terror, like Bellatrix Lestrange, while others were quiet bureaucrats or cowardly opportunists who thought they could hide their crimes behind a facade of enchantment or claims of the Imperius curse. To understand where they ended up, we have to understand how they began. The origins of this group stretch back much further than the First Open War in the 1970s. It began in the corridors of Hogwarts in the 1930s and 40s with a brilliant, handsome boy named Tom Riddle. He didn't call them Death Eaters then. They were his friends, or as Dumbledore more accurately described them, a collection of the weak seeking protection, the ambitious seeking glory, and the thuggish seeking a leader who could show them more refined forms of cruelty. As Tom Riddle transformed into Lord Voldemort, these schoolyard alliances hardened into a paramilitary cult. By the time the First Wizarding War reached its peak, the Death Eaters were a well-oiled machine of terror. They operated in the shadows, wearing masks to hide their identities, ensuring that no one knew who to trust. Your neighbour, your co-worker, or even your cousin could be hiding a dark mark under their sleeve. Then came the night of October 31st, 1981. In a single moment, at Godric's Hollow, the movement was decapitated. With Voldemort gone, the Death Eaters were forced to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Some, like the Lestranges and Barty Crouch Jr., went looking for their master, proving a loyalty that would lead them to the deepest cells of Azkaban. Others, like Lucius Malfoy, used their wealth and influence to claim they had been bewitched, effectively buying their way back into polite society. For 14 years, the survivors lived in a state of uneasy peace, some rotting in prison, others thriving in the very ministry they once sought to destroy. But the mark never truly disappeared. Yet it remained as a faint scar, a ticking time bomb waiting for the day it would burn black once again. When Voldemort rose again in the graveyard of Little Hangleton in 1995, the roll call was incomplete. Some were dead, some were imprisoned, and one had famously turned traitor. The Second Wizarding War was different. It was faster, more desperate, and ultimately more violent. The The stakes had shifted from a quest for power to a battle for the very soul of the magical world. As we look at the fates of these 32 individuals, a tapestry of human nature at its most dark and complex. The tragic fall of Severus Snape, the double agent who played the deadliest game in history. The cowardice of Igor Karkaroff, who sold out his comrades only to find that there is no hiding from a Dark Lord's vengeance. The calculated survivalism of the Malfoy family and the mindless brutality of the Carrow siblings. The final reckoning at the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998 was the end of an era. As the sun rose over the Great Hall, the ranks of the Death Eaters were shattered forever. But the question remains, what happened in the aftermath? Who was sent back to Azkaban under a reformed ministry? Who managed to flee to the corners of the earth? And how did the wizarding world ensure that such a group could never rise again? To answer these questions, we have to look at every single one of them. We have to trace their paths from the moment they took the oath to the moment their journey ended. Whether that was in a flash of green light, behind the bars of a wizarding prison, or in the quiet, shameful shadows of a world that wanted to forget they ever existed. This is a deep dive into the archives of wizarding history, a look at the rise and fall of the most dangerous organisation to ever walk the halls of Hogwarts. We will explore the fates of the high-ranking generals and the low-level foot soldiers alike. We will examine the nuances of those who were truly evil and those who were simply too afraid to say no. From the early days of the Knights of Walpurgis to the final stand in the Forbidden Forest, this is the complete history of Voldemort's chosen few. Their stories are a warning about the seductive nature of power and the lasting scars of hatred. As we settle in for this journey, let us remember that while the dark marks have faded to scars, the history of what these 32 individuals did can never be erased. The complexity of the Death Eater hierarchy is often overlooked. It wasn't just about who could cast the strongest Cruciatus curse, it was about utility. Voldemort valued different things at different times. In the early days, he needed the prestige of the Sacred 28, the oldest and wealthiest wizarding families who could provide him with social legitimacy and funding. Later, he needed spies within the ministry, people like Augustus Rookwood, who could feed him secrets from the Department of Mysteries. And finally, he needed killers, the ones who wouldn't hesitate when told to eliminate a target. This variety in membership meant that their fates were just as varied. A high-ranking official like Yaxley faced a very different end than a street-level thug like Thorfinn Roll. As we move through the lives of these 32 individuals, we will see how their choices during the interwar years influenced their survival during the final conflict. We will see how the return of Voldemort was a death sentence for some and a second chance for others. We will look at the legal proceedings that followed the Battle of Hogwarts, the reforms led by Kingsley Shacklebolt, and the eventual fate of the Malfoy bloodline. We will also address the individuals who are often mistaken for Death Eaters, but never actually held the rank, such as Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf whose bloodlust was useful to Voldemort, but whose status was considered too low for the mark. Understanding the Death Eaters is essential to understanding the world of Harry Potter. They are the shadow that makes the light of the protagonists shine brighter. They represent the worst impulses of wizarding society: elitism, cruelty, and the desire for absolute control. By looking at what happened to every single one of them, we get a clearer picture of the scale of the conflict and the cost of the victory. So let us begin our examination. We will travel from the dark cells of Azkaban to the opulent drawing rooms of Malfoy Manor, from the giants' camps in the mountains to the secret passages of Hogwarts. This is the definitive account of the 32 who followed the Dark Lord into the abyss, and what they found when they reached the bottom. The number 32 appears again and again in discussions about Voldemort's Death Eaters. You see it in video titles, in forum posts, in fan-made lists that try to pin down exactly who was branded and who was not. But if you scour the 7 books, the films, and even the official supplementary material from the wizarding world, you will never find a scene where Voldemort stands before a neat congregation of exactly 32 followers. The number itself is a fan creation, a tally built from scattered clues and educated guesswork, and it has taken on a life of its own. The question is not whether there were 32 Death Eaters, but why the fandom so desperately wants there to be an exact count. Think about the nature of the Dark Mark. It is a brand that appears on the left forearm of Voldemort's most trusted servants. When the Dark Lord touches one of those marks, every other marked follower feels a burning summons and must apparate to his side. That mechanism implies a closed group. You cannot have a spontaneous army of anonymous soldiers when the summoning system relies on a specific, irreversible tattoo. So the fandom started counting. Who had the mark? Who was named in the books? How many times did the Dark Mark appear in the sky? How many Death Eaters were present at the graveyard in Little Hangleton, or at the battle in the Department of Mysteries? And slowly, a consensus formed around the number 32. It is not canon, but it is the closest thing to an official roster that the community has ever agreed upon. But here is where the distinction becomes crucial. Having the Dark Mark is not the same as being in Voldemort's army. The group we call the Death Eaters was an inner circle, an elite core of devoted wizards and witches who had proven their loyalty beyond doubt. They were the ones who received the mark directly from Voldemort's wand, who knelt before him, who took the vow. Beyond them stretched a much larger network of sympathizers, informants, and mercenaries. The Snatchers, for example, were roaming gangs of dark wizards who captured Muggleborns and fugitives during the Second War. They served the regime, but did not bear the mark. Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf, was useful to Voldemort, but considered too low for membership. He was a weapon, not a disciple. And then there were ministry officials under the Imperius curse, ordinary wizards who sold information for gold or protection, and creatures like giants and dementors who allied with Voldemort out of fear or self-interest. All of them were part of the war machine, but they were not Death Eaters. The inner circle itself was never static. Its membership shifted as followers died, were imprisoned, or fell from favour. When Voldemort first rose to power in the 1970s, he gathered a core of like-minded individuals, many of whom he had known at Hogwarts. They were the ones who committed the worst atrocities of the First Wizarding War. They tortured, murdered, and terrorised the Wizarding and Muggle worlds alike. And then, on the night of Halloween 1981, everything fell apart. Voldemort's killing curse rebounded, his body was destroyed, and the dark mark on each Death Eater's arm burned with a strange new sensation. The chain of command was broken. The summons no longer worked, and in that moment of collapse, the followers scattered. Some were captured soon after. The Ministry's auras, led by Alistair Moody and others, swept through the underworld, to dragging Death Eaters into Azkaban. Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus, his brother Rabastan, and Barty Crouch Jr. were tried and sentenced for torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom into insanity. Others vanished into hiding, pulling their hoods over their faces and melting into the dark corners of the wizarding world. A few, like Igor Karkaroff, chose betrayal and turned informant, naming names in exchange for their freedom. And one, Severus Snape, was never captured at all because he had already turned before the fall, but that is a story for another time. For a decade, the remaining Death Eaters waited. They kept their heads down, whispered in secret, and watched for any sign that their master might return. Some convinced themselves he was truly gone. Others clung to the hope that the Dark Mark was not dead, only dormant. And Lucius Malfoy used his wealth and influence to stay out of Azkaban, all the while pulling strings from within the Ministry. Peter Pettigrew the Rat hid for 12 years in his animagus form, too terrified of both his former allies and the vengeful Sirius Black. The Death Eaters were not a united force during that time. They were a fractured, paranoid collection of remnants, each one trying to survive. But the hunt for Voldemort's followers did not end with the First War. The Ministry never stopped looking for the ones who had eluded capture. Dossiers were compiled, surveillance was maintained, and every former Death Eater was watched. When Voldemort returned in 1995, that surveillance failed. The Inner Circle reformed almost overnight. The Death Eaters, who had remained loyal, felt the summons, apparated to the graveyard. Rosier knelt once more. The number of marked followers had not increased much since the First War. Many of the original 32, whatever that number truly was, were dead or imprisoned. But the core endured. Lucius, Bellatrix, Pettigrew, the Lestranges, the Carrows, Yaxley, and others whose names would fill the wanted posters of the Second War. And that brings us to the threshold of the next chapter. Because the Inner Circle did not simply appear fully formed, Voldemort had to recruit them, groom them, bind them. The earliest of those followers were not born into darkness. They were drawn into it by a young man named Tom Riddle, who was still a student at Hogwarts when he began collecting his first disciples. Who were they? How did a teenage wizard, without wealth or influence, convince his peers to swear eternal loyalty? That story begins in the corridors of Hogwarts in the 1940s, long before the Dark Mark was ever burned into a single arm. Last time, we explored the foggy origins of the so-called 32 Death Eaters and the difference between a branded Inner Circle and the vast sea of sympathisers. But every shadow has a first spark, and for Voldemort, that spark was lit in the stone corridors of Hogwarts during the 1940s, when he was still just Tom Riddle, a brilliant, orphaned boy with a smile that promised everything, and eyes that promised nothing. Riddle understood from the start that power is built on people. At Hogwarts, the most obvious network of influence was Horace Slughorn's Slug Club, a collection of the talented, the connected, the promising. Slughorn loved to collect these students, like trophies, and he was especially fond of Tom Riddle, who could charm a professor into handing over knowledge, praise and protection without ever revealing his own hand. But behind Slughorn's back, Riddle was weaving a different kind of club. He chose his recruits not for academic success or family name alone, but for their willingness to follow without question. These early followers called themselves the Knights of Walpurgis, a name that hinted at dark rituals and secret oaths, a title that would later be whispered alongside the word Death Eater. The very first recruits came from families that valued blood purity above all else. Nott and Rosier, two names that would echo through generations of dark wizardry. A Nott had been part of the sacred 28 for centuries, and a Rosier had served in the highest circles of pure blood society. But these boys were already steeped in the belief that muggle-born witches and wizards were inferior, that magic belonged to the old families. But Tom Riddle did not simply reinforce those beliefs. He weaponized them. He spoke of a future where the pure would rule, where the weak would be purged, and where those who followed him would stand at his side as lords of a new order. To boys like Nott and Rosier, that vision was irresistible. They became the prototype of what a Death Eater would be, loyal unto death, willing to commit any cruelty in the name of a cause they barely understood, and bound to Riddle not by the Dark Mark, that would come later, but by sheer force of personality. Those school days were a rehearsal. The Knights of Walpurgis met in secret, whispered curses in empty classrooms, and tested the limits of what Hogwarts would tolerate. They learned to trust only each other, to mask their intentions behind perfect grades and polite smiles. But when Tom Riddle left Hogwarts, the game changed. The 1950s were what historians call his wilderness years. A decade he spent largely out of public view, working at Borgin and Burke's, collecting dark artifacts and quietly building the structure that would become the Death Eaters. The schoolboy gang could no longer exist. It had to transform into something that could move through the shadows of the wizarding world, recruit older followers, acquire dark knowledge, and prepare for war. This transition was not abrupt. It was slow, methodical, and ruthless. Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort, began marking his most trusted disciples with the Dark Mark, a brand that tied them to him forever. The first to receive it were almost certainly those who had been with him since Hogwarts, the ones who had already proven their devotion. The Knights of Walpurgis became something far darker, a paramilitary force that answered only to one voice, a secret army that would one day terrorize the Ministry and fight the Order of the Phoenix. But that first generation of followers set the pattern: pure blood ideology, absolute loyalty, and a willingness to die for the cause. That pattern, forged in the 1940s and hardened in the 1950s, is what made the Death Eaters what they became. And among those earliest disciples, one name stands out for a fate that encapsulates the entire journey from schoolboy loyalty to violent, tragic end. That name belongs to Evan Rosier, whose fall came not in the quiet of a dark ritual, but in a duel that left even Alastair Moody shaken. The fall of Evan Rosier is the story of how the Knights became killers, and how the first followers paid for their choice with their lives. The Rosier name first appeared in the shadows of the Slug Club, when Tom Riddle himself singled out a young Rosier as one of his earliest acolytes in the long campaign for pure blood supremacy. That early Rosier, likely the father, or perhaps an uncle, of the man we're about to discuss, set a dangerous precedent. He proved that the Rosier family was willing to walk the path of radicalism, that they would stand beside a half-blood wizard who promised to restore their kind to absolute power. But it was the next generation that would burn brightest and fall fastest in the flames of the First Wizarding War. Evan Rosier was not the founder of the movement, but he became one of its most loyal soldiers during the darkest years of the 1970s. When the war between the Ministry and Voldemort's Death Eaters escalated into open, bloody conflict, Rosier was there. He fought alongside the Lestranges, alongside Mulciber, alongside those who revelled in the chaos and the terror. But unlike many of his comrades, Evan Rosier did not survive to see the Dark Lord's first defeat. He met his end in a duel that would become legend, not for its glory, but for its merciless finality. To understand the fall of Evan Rosier, you must first understand the war itself. The First Wizarding War was not a clean conflict. There were no front lines, no declared battles, no rules of engagement that either side respected. Death Eaters struck from the shadows, torturing and murdering Muggleborns, Ministry officials, anyone who stood in Voldemort's path. And the Ministry, led first by Millicent Bagnold and then by her ruthless successor, Barty Crouch Sr., responded in kind. Crouch was not a man for half measures. He gave his aurors unprecedented authority. They were authorized to use any force necessary, including lethal force, against suspected Death Eaters. This was the era when the phrase "shoot to kill" entered the lexicon of magical law enforcement. Alastair Moody embodied that policy. He was not yet the paranoid, one-legged veteran of countless skirmishes. He was a young and terrifyingly effective auror, already known for his relentless pursuit of dark wizards. When word reached the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that Evan Rosier had been located near the outskirts of a small village in the Welsh countryside, Moody did not hesitate. He assembled a strike team and moved in with the kind of surgical precision that would later define his legend. The duel that followed was vicious and short. Rosier, cornered and with no escape, fought with the desperation of a man who knew he could not afford to be captured. He cast curses that would have killed lesser wizards, that would have left most disarmed and helpless. But Moody was not most aurors. He deflected every attack, his magical eye spinning wildly to track every flicker and feint. And then, in a moment that would haunt the annals of aura history, Rosier made a fatal mistake. He attempted to use a curse of such dark power that it required a clear line of sight and absolute concentration. Moody saw the opening. He seized it. The exact details of Rosier's death remain classified in Ministry archives, but whispers persist. Some say Moody blasted him through a stone wall. Others claim the duel ended with a single, perfectly aimed curse that left no room for survival. What is certain is that Evan Rosier died that night, and Alastair Moody carved a notch into his ever-growing list of captured or killed Death Eaters. But Rosier's death was more than a single casualty. It became a symbol. Barty Crouch Sr. publicly praised Moody's actions, using them to justify the increasingly harsh measures his department was taking. If a Death Eater as dangerous as Rosier could be killed in the line of duty, and then no dark wizard was safe. The message was clear. The Ministry would not hesitate to use lethal force. It was a policy that saved lives perhaps, but it also blurred the line between justice and execution. Rosier's death became a rallying cry for both sides. For the Ministry, it was proof that they were winning. For Voldemort, it was a martyrdom he could exploit. In death, Evan Rosier achieved something he could not in life. He cemented his family's legacy within the Dark Lord's ranks. The Rosiers had already proven their loyalty through decades of service. Now they had shed blood, and Voldemort never forgot such sacrifices. When the Dark Lord returned in the 1990s, other members of the Rosier family were ready to take up the mantle, their devotion hardened by the memory of Evan's fall. The Rosier name remained a badge of honour among those who still believed, yet not every Death Eater who fell in the First War left such a clear mark. There were others whose names are barely whispered now, whose ends are lost to the chaos of those years. Names like Wilkes, who vanished into the fog of battle without a single record of how he died. And there are still more unnamed casualties, fresh-faced young wizards and witches who joined Voldemort's cause and were never heard from again. Their stories too deserve to be remembered, if only to remind us that war consumes the loyal and the foolish alike. And that is where we will turn next, to the forgotten fates of Wilkes and the unnamed casualties, the ones history has all but erased. Evan Rosier was not the only casualty of that brutal First War, nor was he the most mysterious. The Ministry's policy of lethal force under Barty Crouch Sr. carved a bloody path through Voldemort's ranks, and among the fallen was a figure so obscure that even his first name has been lost to history. We know him only as Wilkes. Wilkes, a surname that appears in passing, in whispers, in the margins of interrogations and the footnotes of Azkaban intake records. He was a Death Eater, branded with the Dark Mark, a true believer in the cause of pure blood supremacy. But unlike Bellatrix Lestrange or Lucius Malfoy, he left behind no family legacy, no famous duel, no dramatic final stand. What we have is a single, devastating sentence from the testimony of Igor Karkaroff. Wilkes was killed by Aurors. No details of the battle, no name of the Auror who struck him down, no record of his last words. That silence is itself a story. In the First Wizarding War, the Death Eaters were not a fixed roster of 32. They were a dispersed network, operating in cells, wearing masks and dying in shadows. The Ministry did not publicly celebrate every kill. The Dark Lord did not publicly mourn every servant. Some deaths were simply erased from the narrative, buried beneath the chaos of a conflict that saw dozens of wizards and witches fall on both sides. Wilkes was one of those erased. But why? Why do we know the name of Evan Rosier, whose severed ear became a trophy for Alastair Moody? Yet Wilkes remains a ghost. The answer lies in the politics of martyrdom. Rosier was a pure blood from an established family. His death a rallying cry for the Death Eaters who survived. His name was spoken in secret meetings, his memory invoked to fuel hatred for the Ministry. Wilkes, by contrast, may have been from a lesser line, or perhaps he died so quietly that no one thought to make a symbol of him. In war, not every soldier becomes a legend. Some are simply statistics, and the attrition rate was staggering. By the time Voldemort fell at Godric's Hollow in 1981, a significant portion of his inner circle had been killed or captured. The Ministry's records from that era, though incomplete, indicate that out of the roughly 24 known Death Eaters active in the late 70s, at least 6 were dead by the end of the war. Among them, Rosier, Wilkes, and a handful of others whose names we will never know. They were casualties of a conflict that the wizarding world preferred to forget, buried in unmarked graves, or lost to the oblivion of Azkaban. Wilkes' story, or lack thereof, forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the Death Eaters as a historical phenomenon. We tend to focus on the survivors, the betrayers, the ones who lived long enough to be named in trials or remembered in books. But for every Igor Karkaroff who turned informant, for every Lucius Malfoy who evaded justice, there were followers who simply did not make it. Their dark marks faded with their last breath. Their bodies were never claimed. What makes this even more poignant is that Voldemort himself contributed to the erasure. He was not a sentimental master. He did not erect monuments to the fallen. In his philosophy, death was the ultimate failure, and those who died in his service were either weak or unlucky. He never spoke of Wilkes after his death. He never acknowledged the sacrifice. For the Dark Lord, the only legacy that mattered was his own. Yet in the fandom, we cling to these fragments. We wonder about the Death Eater, who never got a chapter, never got a wand movement, never got a line in the books. Wilkes is a name that appears only in the context of Karkaroff's trial, a single mention that has sparked decades of speculation. Some have speculated he was the one who died during the attack on the McKinnon family. Others believe he was killed in a skirmish with the Order of the Phoenix, but the truth is we do not know, and perhaps that is the point. The First War was a war of shadows. Aurors wore plain clothes, used lethal force, and worked without the oversight of the later Ministry. The Death Eaters were equally elusive, striking in the dark and disappearing into the underworld. In such a conflict, many deaths went unrecorded. Wilkes is a symbol of those countless nameless casualties who fell on both sides, their stories lost to the chaos of war. And yet, there is a lesson here for understanding the Death Eaters as a whole. Not every follower was a Bellatrix, screaming in ecstasy at the Dark Lord's return. Not everyone was a Lucius, maneuvering for power and influence. Some were foot soldiers, cannon fodder, young wizards swept up in an ideology that promised them glory, but delivered only a grave. The attrition rate of the First War ensured that when Voldemort returned in 1995, his ranks were thinner, his inner circle smaller. Many of the original faces were gone, some to Azkaban, some to hiding, and some to death. Wilkes remains a question mark, a ghost in the archives, but his existence reminds us that the 32 Death Eaters we so often count are not a complete picture. They are the survivors, the ones whose names survived the war. The rest, like Wilkes, are whispers in the darkness. As we move forward in this exploration of Voldemort's followers, we will turn next to a man who chose a very different path from Wilkes. A man who, when faced with the prospect of execution, decided to trade loyalty for survival. That man was Igor Karkaroff, and his defection would send shockwaves through the Death Eater ranks. But before we meet him in the courtroom, we must first understand the world he was trying to escape. A world where men like Wilkes died forgotten, and where the Dark Lord's embrace was often a prelude to the grave. We left Wilkes in the silence of an unmarked grave, one of the many Death Eaters whose names barely survive in Ministry records. But not every follower of Voldemort met their end in open battle or behind the walls of Azkaban. Some, when the Dark Lord fell in 1981, chose a different path entirely. They chose to talk. Igor Karkaroff is perhaps the most infamous defector in Death Eater history. He was captured by Aurors in the chaos following Voldemort's apparent defeat, and like many of his former comrades, he found himself in an iron cell awaiting trial before the Wizengamot. But Karkaroff understood something that others did not. The Ministry was desperate for convictions. They wanted names, they wanted closure, and they were willing to trade freedom for information. So when Karkaroff stood in that stone chamber, chains clinking around his wrists, He did not plead for mercy on the grounds of innocence or coercion. He pleaded for amnesty. He offered the Wizengamot not his loyalty, but his memory. He would give them the names of other Death Eaters, men and women, who had not yet been caught, in exchange for his own release. The court listened. Bartemius Crouch Sr. was then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and he was hungry for results. Karkaroff's testimony led directly to the capture of several Death Eaters who had managed to evade justice, including Augustus Rookwood, a spy within the Ministry. It was a bitter trade, but the Ministry accepted it. For the surviving inner circle of Voldemort's followers, Karkaroff's betrayal was unforgivable. He had not merely run away or gone into hiding. He had actively sold them out, named them, and helped put them behind bars. To break your oath, to expose your brothers in darkness, was the deepest treachery a Death Eater could commit. The resentment festered. Once he was free, Karkaroff vanished from British Wizarding Society, but he did not stay hidden. Somehow, improbably, he managed to secure the position of headmaster at Durmstrang Institute, the prestigious school of magic in the far north. How he convinced the Durmstrang Board of Governors to trust a man with such a stained past is a story lost to time. But the appointment stood. For over a decade, Karkaroff ruled over that school with an iron grip, respected if not beloved, hiding his former allegiances beneath a facade of authority. When Voldemort returned in the summer of 1995, the dark mark on Karkaroff's arm began to burn again. He knew what it meant. The Lord he had abandoned was alive and calling. Karkaroff did not go back. He fled, abandoning his post at Durmstrang, disappearing into the wilderness. But the inner circle never forgot. In 1996, they found him. It is said that Antonin Dolohov, along with several other loyal Death Eaters, cornered Karkaroff in a remote location. There was no trial, no plea for amnesty this time. They executed him on the spot. A final punishment for the betrayal he had committed 15 years earlier. The defector had bought his freedom once. But freedom does not last when the past comes looking for you. And the man who likely delivered that final blow, the duelist known for his ruthless efficiency, is a story worth telling in its own right. That brings us to Antonin Dolohov, the brutal duelist. Karkaroff's betrayal cut deep into the inner circle. He stood before the Wizengamot and, in a tremulous voice, traded names for his freedom. Among those he condemned was Antonin Dolohov, a man whose very presence in the courtroom would have sent a chill down the spines of even the most hardened Aurors. Dolohov was not just another Death Eater. He was a blunt instrument of terror, a duelist whose reputation for violence preceded him like a storm cloud on the horizon. To understand Dolohov, you have to look back at the First Wizarding War, when the Ministry was losing ground and bodies were piling up in alleyways. It was Dolohov who, alongside his comrades, cornered Gideon and Fabian Pruett, two of the most formidable fighters the Order of the Phoenix had ever produced. The battle that followed was not a quick execution. It was brutal, prolonged, and left a lasting scar on the wizarding world. The Pruett brothers fought with everything they had, but Dolohov's savagery and his command of non-verbal curses overwhelmed them. Their deaths were a hammer blow to the Order, and they cemented Dolohov's reputation as one of Voldemort's most efficient killers. But it was the curse that became his signature, a swirling, violet flame that could tear through flesh and bone alike. Dolohov had honed his magic to a point where spoken incantations were a liability. In the heat of a duel, a single flick of his wand was enough. He did not shout, he acted, and that made him terrifying. Aurors trained against counterspells and verbal cues, but Dolohov gave them nothing to anticipate. You would see the flash of light, feel the impact, and then the world would go dark. After Voldemort's first fall, Dolohov was one of the many swept up by the Auror Dragnet. Karkaroff's testimony, along with the memories of others who had turned informant, ensured he was sent to Azkaban. For over a decade, he sat in a freezing cell, the Dementors feeding on his memories and his malice. But that rage never dimmed. When the mass breakout occurred in 1996, Dolohov was among the first to slip back into the world, and he wasted no time rejoining his master's cause. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries was where Dolohov truly reasserted his menace. He was there, among the 12 Death Eaters who ambushed Harry Potter and his friends. But what stood out was his unyielding control in the chaos. While others fumbled or cried out their curses, Dolohov moved through the Hall of Prophecies like a silent predator. He took down Hermione Granger with a single non-verbal curse, a devastating blow that left her writhing in agony, barely clinging to life. That moment alone would have been enough to remind the wizarding world that Dolohov was no relic of a past war. He was a present danger, refined and practiced. Even after the debacle at the Ministry, when most of his fellow Death Eaters were captured again, Dolohov escaped. He vanished into the shadows, and for the next 2 years, he operated as one of Voldemort's key assassins. He was involved in the murder of innocent families, the intimidation of Ministry officials, and the systematic elimination of anyone who posed a threat. His name became shorthand for the kind of violence that could not be reasoned with. And then came the Battle of Hogwarts. All of that fury, all of that skill funneled into the final confrontation. Dolohov fought with the same cold efficiency he always had. He cut down defenders, moved with lethal grace, and seemed unstoppable. But he had not accounted for Phileas Flitwick. The diminutive charms professor, often underestimated, had been a dueling champion in his youth. When the two met on the battlefield, it was not a clash of brute force, but of technique and composure. Flitwick's speed and precision outmatched Dolohov's savagery. In a matter of moments, Dolohov was knocked to the ground, defeated and bound. The brutal duelist was finally taken out of the war. It is a fitting end for a man who lived by violence and died by superior skill, but his legacy lingers in the scars he left on the people he hurt. The Pruitt brothers, Hermione Granger, and countless others whose names are lost to history. Antonin Dolohov was not a mastermind. He was not a schemer. He was a weapon. And like all weapons, he was eventually broken. Now the war did not end with one death or one capture. In the Ministry itself, there was a man who had been feeding Voldemort intelligence for years. A quiet presence in the Department of Mysteries, who never raised a wand in open battle. His name was Augustus Rookwood, and his story is one of silent betrayal and the kind of espionage that can topple a government from within. Antonin Dolohov was a storm of raw violence, a wizard who carved his legend through the bodies of Aurors and the screams of the innocent. But even the most brutal duelists need intelligence to aim their fury, and that is where the true damage began. Not with a curse, but with a whisper. Not with a wand raised high, but with a quill dipped in Ministry ink. Augustus Rookwood was never meant to be a frontline soldier. He was a strategist, a spider, at the centre of a web that stretched from the Department of Mysteries to the darkest corners of the Wizengamot. As an unspeakable, he had access to the most classified secrets of the British magical government, time manipulation research, prophecy records, intelligence on dark artifacts, and the operational protocols of the Auror office itself. And for years, he fed every single piece of it directly to Lord Voldemort. Think about what that meant. The Ministry believed it could operate in the shadows, that the most sensitive work in the entire government was sealed away behind enchanted doors and unbreakable vows. But Rookwood walked those halls every day. He knew the schedules of the security rotations. He knew which vaults held the most dangerous experimental magic. He knew where the Ministry's countermeasures were weakest. And he knew the names of every high-ranking official who might be susceptible to bribery or blackmail. He did not need to cast a single killing curse to destroy lives. He simply gave Voldemort the blueprint for how to dismantle Wizarding Britain from within. The first Wizarding War was not won by brute force alone. It was won by chaos, by the systematic erosion of trust, by the undermining of every institution designed to protect the innocent. Rookwood's intelligence allowed Death Eaters to strike precisely where it would hurt most. When an Auror raid was expected, they avoided it. When a safe house was compromised, they were already gone. When a ministry official spoke out against the Dark Lord, their family was targeted before they could even file a report. Rookwood was the invisible hand that turned every ministry advantage into a trap. But no web lasts forever. After Voldemort's fall in 1981, the Death Eaters scattered, and the ministry began rounding up the survivors. Rookwood managed to vanish for a time, but the net was closing. And then Igor Karkaroff, the same man we explored earlier, the turncoat who sold his comrades for a chance at freedom, took the stand before the Wizengamot. He named names, and among those names was Augustus Rookwood. The testimony was damning. Karkaroff revealed not just Rookwood's membership in the inner circle, but the exact nature of his espionage. He described how Rookwood had leaked intelligence on the Department of Mystery's most guarded projects, how he had passed along the names of undercover auras, how he had facilitated the assassination of multiple ministry officials. The Wizengamot had no choice. Rookwood was sentenced to life in Azkaban, his position as an unspeakable revoked, his reputation in ashes. For over a decade, he rotted in that frozen fortress, the Dementors feeding on his memories of power, but Voldemort never forgot his most valuable agents. In 1996, when the Dark Lord orchestrated the mass breakout from Azkaban, Rookwood was among those freed. He stepped back into the world not as a broken man, but as a revenge-fueled tactician. In the Second Wizarding War, Rookwood's contributions were purely strategic. He did not seek glory on the battlefield. He sought information. He became one of Voldemort's primary intelligence assets, advising on ministry movements, decoding intercepted messages, and identifying potential weaknesses in the Order of the Phoenix's operations. He was the one who helped coordinate the capture of ministry officials, who knew exactly which safe houses were worth attacking and which were traps. By the time the Battle of Hogwarts erupted, Rookwood was deep in the command structure, feeding data to the Death Eater ranks. He was there when the final assault began, but he was not a fighter. He was a planner, and when Voldemort fell, Rookwood's fate was sealed. He was captured, returned to Azkaban, and left to rot once more, this time without hope of rescue. But his legacy is a chilling reminder. The most dangerous enemies are not always the ones with the loudest curses. Sometimes, they are the ones with the quietest access. And the worst damage they do is not written in blood, but in classified files and whispered secrets. That is the nature of the war behind the war. And next, we turn to a wizard who perfected the art of making others do his bidding without ever lifting a wand. A man whose mastery of the Imperius curse turned loyal souls into puppets, and whose name became synonymous with control itself. The previous chapter ended with Augustus Rookwood's quiet dismantling of the ministry from inside the Department of Mysteries, a betrayal that went undetected for years because it relied on access, not violence. But Rookwood was a spy, an information broker. His methods were subtle, almost civilized, compared to what his compatriot Mulciber specialized in. Where Rookwood stole secrets, Mulciber stole minds. To understand Mulciber is to understand the Imperius curse, not as a spell, but as an art form. While many Death Eaters could force the incantation and compel someone to walk off a cliff, Mulciber was renowned for a far more insidious mastery. He could weave the curse so finely, so delicately, that the victim never even knew the thread was around their will. They would continue their lives, eat breakfast, go to work, laugh with friends, all while a foreign presence nudged their decisions, voting records, security rotations, confidential memos. The victim remained conscious, autonomous in every trivial moment, yet completely compromised in the moments that mattered. This is what made Mulciber so valuable to Voldemort during the First Wizarding War. He didn't need to kill ministry officials. He needed to own them, and Mulciber could do that without leaving a single scar, without a single scream to alert the auras. The psychological impact of his crimes rippled far beyond the individuals he controlled, because if a ministry worker could be compromised without knowing it, then no one could trust anyone. The paranoia that settled over the Department of Magical Law Enforcement during those years was not a natural byproduct of war. It was cultivated by Mulciber, one quiet curse at a time. He was arrested repeatedly, yet each time he sat in an interrogation cell with a calm smile. The Aurors could never prove the extent of his influence. The victims themselves, when the curse was lifted, often had no memory of their servitude. They would break down in confusion, unable to testify against the man who had used them like puppets. So the ministry would hold Mulciber for a few months on lesser charges and then release him, and he would walk out, pick up his wand, and begin again. He was a true believer, a man who never wavered in his devotion to the Dark Lord. When Voldemort fell in 1981, Mulciber didn't flee or recant. He was captured during a raid on a safe house, and when brought before the Wizengamot, he offered no defense. He simply stood silent, accepting his life sentence to Azkaban without a whisper of regret. And that silence, that refusal to betray even a scrap of information, marked him as one of the inner circle's most trusted soldiers. While Igor Karkaroff sang for his freedom, while others crawled into shadows and claimed they had been cursed themselves, Mulciber rotted in his cell, waiting. When the Death Eaters broke out of Azkaban in 1996, Mulciber emerged not as a broken man, but as a coiled spring. He slipped back into his old patterns immediately, and by the time the Battle of Hogwarts arrived, he was once again working the Imperius behind the scenes. But here is where the record becomes frustratingly thin. We know he was present at the final battle. We know he fought. But after Voldemort's defeat, the trials become a haze. Some sources suggest he was killed in the chaos. Others claim he was recaptured and spent the rest of his life in a special containment cell at Azkaban. His wand snapped, his mouth gagged to prevent even a whisper of the Imperius. What we do know is that the faded dark mark on his arm, like so many others, became just a scar. But unlike many Death Eaters who tried to rewrite their pasts or plead youthful folly, Mulciber likely never did. He believed until the end. That kind of unshakable loyalty, that refusal to break even when faced with a lifetime of Dementors, raises uncomfortable questions about the men who fought beside him. What made a wizard like Avery, for instance, so pliable that he would follow Lucius Malfoy's lead one moment and the Dark Lord's the next? Or Selwyn, whose name appears on guest lists and crime reports alike, a shadow among shadows. Their stories are tangled, filled with half-truths and erased memories, and that is exactly where we need to look next. The Imperius Curse was Mulciber's specialty, and through it he turned the minds of ministry officials into puppets, strings pulled from the shadows of the First War. But when Voldemort fell, the curse became a convenient shield for many who had once worn the dark mark with pride. Some claimed they had been forced, others insisted they had resisted, and the Wizengamot spent years untangling truth from self-serving lies. Among those who pleaded the Imperius defense was a man named Avery, and his fate stands as one of the most telling contrasts in the entire Death Eater saga. Avery was a member of the Inner Circle, or at least he had been. He had stood beside Voldemort in the days of terror, had knelt in the graveyard at Little Hangleton when the Dark Lord rose again in the summer of 1995, but his loyalty was brittle. When the Ministry finally caught him after Voldemort's first defeat, Avery did not go silently to Azkaban like Bellatrix or the Lestranges. He talked. He claimed he had acted under the Imperius curse, that he had been a victim, not a villain. And the Ministry, desperate to believe that the war could be blamed on a single madman and a handful of fanatics, accepted his story. He walked free, but the Dark Lord never forgot. Voldemort was not a being who understood mercy, and he had a long memory for betrayal. When he returned to power, he summoned his Death Eaters to the graveyard, and Avery was among them. The scene was one of savage theatre. Voldemort strode among his kneeling followers, touching their faces, naming them aloud, and when he reached Avery, he paused. There was a cold silence. Then Voldemort spoke of the Imperius defense, of the cowardice that had led a marked Death Eater to deny his master. He did not kill Avery in that moment. That would have been too quick. Instead, he humiliated him in front of the others. He inflicted pain, a cruel demonstration of the power Avery had betrayed. And when Voldemort finished, Avery lay trembling on the grass, broken but alive, a living reminder that desertion carried a price worse than death. He would serve again, but he would serve in fear. Now contrast that with Selwyn. Selwyn was not a man who pleaded innocence. He was a militant, a pure-blood zealot who wore his allegiance like armour. When Voldemort returned, Selwyn did not cower. He was present at the Battle of the Department of Mysteries, though he was one of the 11 captured after Sirius Black fell. But while others like Lucius Malfoy scrambled to re-establish favour, Selwyn seemed to embrace the violence of the Second War without hesitation. He was part of the ambush of the Seven Potters, that chaotic night when Harry Potter was smuggled from Privet Drive to safety. Selwyn flew alongside the other Death Eaters, casting curses, hunting the boy who had become the symbol of resistance. He might have been among those who attacked George Weasley, tearing off an ear with dark magic. He was there, in the cold air, among the streaks of light and screams. And later, when the Ministry fell and Voldemort's grip tightened on Wizarding Britain, Selwyn was given a darker task. He was sent to the home of Xenophilius Lovegood, the eccentric editor of the Quibbler, whose daughter Luna had been taken hostage. Selwyn did not come to talk. He came to torture. He and Travers, the Death Eater we will examine soon, used the Cruciatus curse on Xenophilius, twisting his mind until he agreed to betray Harry Potter. That scene, glimpsed through the pages of a hidden story, reveals the difference between Avery and Selwyn. Avery tried to save himself with lies. Selwyn never needed lies because he never doubted. He inflicted pain without remorse. The fates of these two men diverged like paths in a dark forest. Avery survived the war, but he lived in shadow, a man who had been broken in front of his master and never truly restored. Selwyn too survived, but his story is murkier. He was at the Battle of Hogwarts, fighting until the end. When Voldemort died, Selwyn likely tried to flee or blend into the chaos. The Ministry after the war did hunt down the remaining Death Eaters, but some, like Selwyn, may have escaped justice or received leniency in exchange for information. We do not know for certain. What we do know is that Avery's cowardice and Selwyn's brutality represent two sides of the same coin. The terror of service to a Dark Lord who demanded everything and gave nothing. One knelt and wept, one stood and cursed, and in their ending, that Voldemort's followers were not a monolith, but a collection of broken and hardened souls, each shaped by the choices they made when the Dark Mark burned. Now, the next chapter will turn to a Death Eater, whose name is forever linked with the murder of the McKinnons, a family whose deaths sent ripples through the Order of the Phoenix. Travers was more than a militant. He was a strategist, a man who used his position in the Ministry to destroy from within. But as we will see, even the most careful plans can unravel when the truth finally comes to light. The previous chapter left us with a bitter taste of cowardice and cruelty, comparing the fates of Avery, who grovelled under the Imperius curse, and Selwyn, who clung to his master's favour until the very end. But among the Death Eaters, there were those who operated in a different kind of shadow, not merely as thugs or spies, but as instruments of calculated terror designed to break a family, a bloodline, and a community all at once. One such figure was Travers, a name that would become synonymous with one of the most devastating attacks on a wizarding household during the First War, the massacre of the McKinnons. The McKinnon family had been pillars of the anti-dark movement. Marlene McKinnon was a promising and fierce member of the original Order of the Phoenix, and her family home was a hub of resistance activity. For Voldemort, eliminating such a family was not just a tactical strike, it was a message. Travers, along with a handful of other Death Eaters, was given the task of ensuring that no McKinnon survived to see the next dawn. The attack came without warning. The house was breached in the dead of night, and the spells that followed were swift, efficient, and utterly merciless. Marlene McKinnon's parents, her younger brother, and she herself were all cut down. Only their neighbour, who heard the commotion and alerted the ministry, would later recount the scene, a scene that would haunt the wizarding world for years. The official record would later state that Marlene McKinnon was tortured beyond recognition. A phrase that barely scratches the surface of the horror. Travers was not a duelist like Dolohov or a mind controller like Mulciber. He was a specialist in extermination, in ensuring that entire bloodlines were erased from history. For him, the McKinnon name was simply a target on a list, but for the Order, it was a devastating loss that shook the very foundation of their morale. And when the First War ended with Voldemort's apparent fall, Travers did not face justice for that night. Instead, he slipped away, melting into the shadows of a world that thought the nightmare was over. It would be nearly a decade before Travers resurfaced, and when he did, it was not in a duel or a raid, but in a moment of stunning audacity. After the Ministry finally caught him, connected to a string of post-war crimes, he was placed in the highest security holding cells. But Travers had not spent his years in hiding idly. He had cultivated contacts, bribed guards, and studied the very architecture of his own captivity. When Voldemort's return triggered the Second Great Uprising in 1995, Travers was ready. He escaped from Ministry custody in a coordinated effort that left several Aurors dead and a trail of confusion in its wake. The official narrative painted it as a simple breakout, but those who knew Travers understood that he had never been truly imprisoned. He had merely been waiting, and then came his most infamous feat. As Voldemort's influence spread and the Ministry fell under puppet rule, Travers secured a position inside Gringotts Wizarding Bank. How he managed to infiltrate the most secure financial institution in the wizarding world remains a subject of speculation, but his role was clear. He was a liaison between the Death Eaters and the Goblin-run vaults, monitoring suspicious transactions and ensuring that enemy assets were frozen. The irony, of course, is deliciously poetic. For years, Travers had been the hunter of families. Now he was the gatekeeper of gold, and yet, he never saw the true threat approaching until it was too late. In the spring of 1998, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger broke into Gringotts to steal Helga Hufflepuff's cup from the Lestrange's vault. The trio did not know that Travers was working at the bank that day. They did not know that he was the very man who had once murdered Marlene McKinnon, a woman who had been a close friend of Harry's mother, Lily. But when the alarm was raised and the chaos erupted, Travers was among the first to be overwhelmed. He was not a fighter in the way Bellatrix or Dolohov were. When the dragon broke free and the vaults began to collapse, Travers was caught in the confusion. He was later discovered, disarmed and half buried under rubble, by Aurors who arrived after the trio had escaped. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of an entire family was reduced to a pathetic figure, whimpering in the debris of a ruined bank. When Voldemort finally fell at the Battle of Hogwarts, Travers simply vanished. Some say he was captured in the subsequent roundup and died in Azkaban. Others whisper that he fled abroad, taking a new name and a quiet life of paranoia. But the truth is that no one knows for certain. The last official mention of Travers places him in Ministry custody, but the paperwork is suspiciously incomplete. What is certain is that the Macnair family name never recovered. Marlene's face appears on the tapestry of lost Order members, a ghostly reminder of a future that was stolen, and Travers, the man who stole it, became just another footnote in a war that left thousands of pages unwritten. But if Travers represents the cold efficiency of annihilation, then there is another Death Eater whose methods were far more visceral, far more personal. He did not orchestrate family massacres from the shadows. He performed his executions in broad daylight with a smile and a blade. His name was Walden Macnair, and he was the Ministry's own executioner till he turned his axe on his employers. The story of how Macnair went from killing dangerous beasts to hunting innocent people is one that strips away the last veneer of civilized wizardry. That is for the next chapter. The Ministry of Magic had always been a place of contradictions, a labyrinth of bureaucracy, where the line between justice and cruelty often blurred. Travers, as we discussed, had used his position to cover the blood of the McKinnons, and he slipped through the cracks with the ease of a man who knew exactly where the shadows fell. But there was another figure who walked those same corridors, a man whose official title was Executioner for the Committee for the Disposal of Dangerous Creatures. His name was Walden Macnair, and the title was a convenient mask. Underneath that civil servant's cloak beat the heart of a Death Eater, one who had knelt before Lord Voldemort and eagerly awaited the moment he could trade his axe for a wand. How did Macnair go from a masked terrorist to a respected ministry employee? The answer lies in the panic that gripped wizarding Britain after 1981. When Voldemort fell, the ministry launched a massive purge of Death Eaters. But they were desperate to believe that the rot was contained. Anyone who could claim they had been under the Imperius curse, or who could produce a convincing alibi, was often quietly reabsorbed into the system. Macnair's background as a specialist in the handling of dangerous magical beasts made him useful. The ministry needed someone willing to carry out executions of creatures deemed too dangerous to keep alive. And Macnair was more than willing, he was enthusiastic. So he handed in his mask, accepted a steady paycheck, and for over a decade he carried out his duties with a cold efficiency that no one questioned. But Macnair's bloodlust was not satisfied by beheading hippogriffs or overseeing the deaths of dragons. He remained a loyal servant of the Dark Lord, waiting for the summons. When Voldemort returned in the summer of 1995, Macnair was one of the first to reappear at his side. He was present in the graveyard of Little Hangleton, standing in the circle of Death Eaters, as his master rose from the cauldron. And when Voldemort needed someone to carry out a particularly delicate mission, one that required both brutality and diplomacy, he chose Macnair. That mission was to negotiate with the Giants. Voldemort wanted their allegiance for the coming war, and he needed an envoy who could speak their language, both literally and figuratively. Macnair, with his experience handling enormous, violent creatures, was the perfect choice. He travelled to the mountains where the Giants lived, and alongside the renegade Death Eater Thorfinn Roll, he attempted to sway their leader, Golgamath, into an alliance. It was a brutal, ugly business. Macnair did not use gentle persuasion. He offered power, violence, and the promise of a world where giants could terrorize humans without consequence. He succeeded where the ministry's more diplomatic envoys had failed. The Giants joined Voldemort, and Macnair returned to Britain with a new stripe of loyalty on his sleeve. Through all of this, Macnair kept his ministry job. It was a perfect camouflage. He could walk the halls of the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures, nodding to aurors and clerks, while his dark mark burned under his sleeve. He attended executions, always with a little too much relish. He was the one who swung the axe at the execution of Buckbeak the Hippogriff, an act that nearly went through, but for the intervention of Harry Potter and Hermione Granger. That failure must have stung, but Macnair did not let it slow him down. When the Second Wizarding War broke into the open, Macnair shed all pretense. He joined the assault on the ministry itself, and later he was among the Death Eaters who marched on Hogwarts. The Battle of Hogwarts became his stage. He fought with a savagery that matched his reputation, cutting down defenders with curses and blade alike. He revelled in the chaos, the screams, the smell of smoke and blood. But the battle did not end in a Death Eater victory, and poetic justice awaited him in the most unexpected form. Rubeus Hagrid had every reason to despise Walden Macnair. It was Macnair who had tried to execute Buckbeak, Hagrid's beloved hippogriff. It was Macnair who had sided with the dark forces that had imprisoned Hagrid in Azkaban. And now, as the final clash reached its peak, Hagrid met Macnair face to face. The half-giant, who had always been gentle with creatures but fierce in his own way, did not hesitate. In the chaos of the battle, Macnair, who had prided himself on his control over dangerous beasts, found himself overpowered by the most dangerous beast of all, the fury of a man who had been pushed too far. Hagrid defeated him, and the bloodthirsty executioner was neutralized, his axe clattering to the stone floor of Hogwarts. Macnair's fate after the war is uncertain, but the dark mark on his arm faded to a scar, and his time as a Death Eater was over. He was a man who had hidden in plain sight, who had used the Ministry's blindness to serve a master of terror, and who met his end at the hands of a gentle giant, whose mock kindness he had once mocked. Up next, we turn to the Lestrange brothers. Rodolphus and Rabastan, two Death Eaters whose loyalty to Voldemort was matched only by their devotion to Bellatrix, and whose crimes at the Longbottom family left scars that never fully healed. Their story is one of madness, torture, and an unbreakable bond that would ultimately lead them into the heart of Azkaban and the final battle. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. Walden Macnair may have hidden behind a ministry badge, but the Lestrange brothers never bothered with such deception. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange did not seek cover, did not plead the Imperius curse, did not pretend they had been forced into service. They wore their loyalty like a second skin, and when the First Wizarding War ended with Voldemort's fall, they did not run. They stood, and they paid for that choice in the deepest cell of Azkaban. The Lestrange family was ancient, wealthy, and steeped in the pure-blooded doctrine that Tom Riddle had weaponized. Rodolphus, the elder brother, married Bellatrix Black, a woman whose fanaticism matched his own. Rabastan, the younger, followed without hesitation. Together, they formed a triad of devotion that would become infamous. But it was not merely their beliefs that earned them a place in history. It was what they did on the night of January 24th, 1981. Frank and Alice Longbottom were Aurors, respected and feared by Voldemort's followers. They had been instrumental in bringing down several Death Eaters, and vengeance was a dish served cold in the Dark Lord's ranks. But Voldemort had already fallen by then. Banished at Godric's Hollow only a few months earlier, the Lestranges, along with a young Barty Crouch Jr., did not act on orders from a master. They acted in his name, driven by the belief that if they could break the Longbottoms, they might uncover the location of their vanished lord. They tortured Frank and Alice with the Cruciatus curse until both parents were driven irreversibly insane, their minds shattered beyond any hope of healing. Neville Longbottom was just a baby that night, growing up in a world where his parents could no longer recognize him. The Ministry caught them. The trial was swift and public. Rodolphus, Rabastan, Bellatrix, and Barty Crouch Jr. stood in the dock. And when asked whether they regretted their actions, whether they would renounce the Dark Lord, they refused. Not a single word of remorse. Rabastan Lestrange, according to records, laughed when the sentence was passed. Life in Azkaban was not a punishment to them. It was a badge of honor. They had suffered for their cause, and that suffering bound them closer to Voldemort than any dark mark ever could. Then, after 12 years, the fortress that held them cracked. In January 1996, the mass breakout orchestrated by the Death Eaters freed 10 prisoners, including the Lestrange brothers. They emerged from those stone walls gaunt, hollow-eyed, but unbroken. They had not withered in madness as so many others did. Their hatred had kept them alive. They returned to the world ready to serve again, and Voldemort welcomed them as the faithful soldiers they had always been. During the Second Wizarding War, Rodolphus and Rabastan fought in the Department of Mysteries in June 1996. That battle ended in disaster for the Death Eaters. 11 of them were captured, including the brothers. But this time, they did not return to Azkaban. The Ministry fell to Voldemort's control soon after, and they were freed once more. They vanished into the war machine, serving as enforcers and soldiers, but they never rose to the same prominence as Bellatrix. They were the quiet pillars of the cause, present but not celebrated. Then came the Battle of Hogwarts. Rodolphus and Rabastan were there when the walls of the castle crumbled. They fought alongside their mistress, but the records grow suspiciously vague after that night. We know Bellatrix fell to Molly Weasley. We do not know with certainty what happened to the brothers. Some sources claim Rodolphus was killed during the battle, perhaps by Neville Longbottom, a poetic symmetry given what the Lestranges had done to his parents. Others suggest that both brothers survived, slipped away in the chaos, and lived out the rest of their lives in hiding, their dark marks fading to scars when Voldemort died. The official Wizarding World materials do not confirm either fate. They simply vanish from the narrative. That uncertainty leaves a haunting question. Did the Lestrange bloodline truly end at Hogwarts? Rodolphus and Bellatrix had no children, at least none that were acknowledged. Rabastan, as far as we know, never married. The name Lestrange, once a symbol of pure blood supremacy and unshakable loyalty, may have died with them. Or they might still be out there, two old men with fading tattoos, living in silent exile, waiting for a resurrection that will never come. But there was one Lestrange whose story is not a mystery. She burned brighter, fought harder, and fell with a scream that echoed through the Great Hall. Her name was Bellatrix, and her chapter is next. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange spent over a decade in Azkaban, their minds eroded by Dementors, but their loyalty never wavering. They had been among Voldemort's most trusted followers in the First War, and their torture of the Longbottoms was a crime so heinous it ensured they would never see freedom again. Yet when Voldemort returned, they were among the first to escape and rejoin him. But there was another Lestrange, one whose devotion burned even brighter than her husband's, a witch who had been the Dark Lord's most formidable lieutenant from the very beginning, whose name inspired terror across the wizarding world. Bellatrix Lestrange was not merely a Death Eater. She was the Dark Queen, the embodiment of everything Voldemort valued in a follower: absolute loyalty, ruthless cunning, and a willingness to kill without hesitation. Her descent into madness was not a gradual slip but a deliberate plunge, fueled by her fanatical love for the Dark Lord and her hatred for all who opposed him. Bellatrix was born into the noble and ancient Black family, a lineage steeped in pure blood supremacy and dark magic. She was the eldest daughter of Cygnus and Druella Black, and from a young age she exhibited a cruel streak that set her apart from her sisters. While Narcissa would later choose family over ideology, and Andromeda would become a blood traitor by marrying a Muggle-born, Bellatrix embraced the Black family's darkest traditions with fervour. She was sorted into Slytherin at Hogwarts, where she excelled in the dark arts, and quickly fell under the spell of Tom Riddle, the charismatic prefect who would become Lord Voldemort. By the time she left school, she was already one of his most devoted followers, and she willingly took the dark mark on her left forearm, binding herself to his cause for life. She married Rodolphus Lestrange, but that union was a matter of blood purity, not love. Her true devotion was reserved for Voldemort alone. During the First Wizarding War, Bellatrix was at the forefront of Voldemort's attacks. She participated in the torture and murder of countless Muggles and Muggle-borns, and she was present at the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, Aurors who refused to reveal the Dark Lord's whereabouts after his fall. That crime earned her a life sentence in Azkaban, but the years of Dementor exposure did not break her spirit. Instead, they twisted her into something even more dangerous. When she escaped in the mass breakout of 1996, she emerged as a volatile, unstable force, prone to fits of hysterical laughter and sudden violence. Yet beneath that madness lay a razor-sharp intellect. Voldemort valued her not just for her loyalty, but for her tactical mind. In the Department of Mysteries, she was the one who masterminded the trap to lure Harry Potter to the Ministry. Knowing that he would risk everything to save his godfather, that night at the Ministry, Bellatrix demonstrated her tactical brilliance in the heat of battle. She duelled several members of the Order of the Phoenix simultaneously, holding her own against seasoned wizards like Sirius Black and Kingsley Shacklebolt. But it was her confrontation with Sirius that sealed her reputation as his killer. In a moment of cruel triumph, she struck him with a jet of red light, sending him tumbling through the ancient veil in the death chamber. There was no time for remorse or celebration. The battle raged on, but for Harry Potter, that moment was a wound that would never heal. Bellatrix had taken from him the only family he had left, and she did it with a smirk on her face, reveling in the pain she caused. Her tactical brilliance was on full display again at Malfoy Manor in the spring of 1998. When the Snatchers brought Harry, Ron, and Hermione to the manor, Bellatrix immediately recognized the danger and the opportunity. She did not simply hand them over to Voldemort. She began a calculated interrogation, using the Sword of Gryffindor to test whether it was the real one or a fake. She noticed that Hermione's arm was scarred from the sword's blade, and she knew that if the sword had been taken from Gringotts, it would be a sign that the trio had broken into the Lestrange vault. Her suspicion led her to torture Hermione for information, using the Cruciatus curse with chilling detachment. He sent Draco Malfoy to fetch the Dark Lord, and she kept a close watch on her prisoners, ready to kill them at the slightest threat. That night, she proved that she was more than just a fanatical follower. She was a strategist who could think on her feet and adapt to changing circumstances. It was also at Malfoy Manor that Bellatrix killed Dobby the house elf. When the elf apparated into the cellar to rescue the prisoners, Bellatrix saw him as a nuisance to be eliminated. She threw her silver knife, and the blade found its mark in Dobby's chest. It was a senseless act of cruelty, but it served a purpose. It bought Voldemort time, and it demonstrated that Bellatrix would not hesitate to kill anyone, even a lowly house elf, if they stood in her way. That moment of casual violence revealed the depths of her callousness. She was not merely insane, she was a predator who enjoyed the hunt. At the Battle of Hogwarts, Bellatrix fought with ferocity, cutting down defenders with deadly precision. She duelled Minerva McGonagall, Kingsley Shacklebolt, and Horace Slughorn simultaneously, holding her ground until Voldemort's final defeat became inevitable. But in the chaos of the final duel, she was confronted by someone she had never considered a threat: Molly Weasley. Molly had watched Bellatrix strike down her daughter Ginny, and the mother's fury ignited. When Bellatrix laughed and taunted her, Molly stepped forward and declared that she would finish her. What followed was a duel that encapsulated the entire conflict of the Second Wizarding War. Bellatrix fought with all the dark power and cruel skill she possessed, but Molly fought with something far stronger: love. She deflected Bellatrix's killing curse and struck her with a curse that stopped her heart. Bellatrix Lestrange fell dead. Her body crumpled on the floor of the Great Hall, and the Dark Queen was no more. The symbolic weight of that death cannot be overstated. Bellatrix had devoted her entire existence to Voldemort, sacrificing her sanity, her family, and her life in service to an ideology of pure-blood supremacy and terror. She was the embodiment of obsession, a woman who loved not a person but an idea, and that love had twisted her into a monster. Molly Weasley, by contrast, fought to protect her children, her family, and everything she held dear. Her love was not possessive or destructive. It was nurturing and fierce, a force of nature that could not be defeated by any dark power. In that duel, love triumphed over obsession, and the wizarding world saw that the greatest magic is not found in curses or power, but in the bonds that hold people together. Bellatrix's death was not just the end of a Death Eater, it was the end of an era of fear. Her legacy lives on in the scars she left on those who survived her. Harry Potter would always remember the night Sirius fell through the veil. Hermione would carry the reminder of her torture on her arm, and the wizarding world would never forget the witch who killed Dobby and terrorized the Order of the Phoenix. But Bellatrix's most lasting impact maybe the example she set for other Death Eaters. A cautionary tale of what happens when devotion becomes fanaticism, when love curdles into obsession, and when a witch or wizard gives their entire soul to a cause that cares nothing for them. She believed she was Voldemort's most faithful servant, and in many ways, she was. But in the end, her loyalty did not save her. It destroyed her. There was another Death Eater whose loyalty was just as absolute, but whose methods were far more subtle. He did not rely on raw power or fanatical devotion. He relied on deception and patience. While Bellatrix fought openly for her master, this Death Eater burrowed deep into the heart of the enemy, fooling even Albus Dumbledore himself. His name was Barty Crouch Jr., and his story is one of the most chilling examples of infiltration the wizarding world has ever seen. We have covered the madness of Bellatrix Lestrange, the queen who would tear apart the world for her master. But now we must turn to a figure who is in many ways even more terrifying, because Bellatrix was always mad. Her devotion was a fever that burned from the moment she took the mark. But the man we are about to discuss was not always a monster. He was a son. He was a prodigy. He was a boy who could have been anything, and he chose to become nothing but a vessel for Lord Voldemort. This is the story of Barty Crouch Jr., the perfect infiltrator. The tragedy of the Crouch family is not that they fell from grace. It is that they were already broken, long before the Dark Lord ever touched them. Barty Crouch Sr. was a titan of the Ministry. He was the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the man who gave Aurors the power to use the unforgivable curses against suspected Death Eaters. He was the architect of the First War's most brutal policies, the man who sent countless souls to Azkaban without trial. He was a hero to the public and a tyrant to his own home, and it was that tyranny that created the perfect servant for Voldemort. Barty Crouch Jr. was born into a world of cold expectation. His father was not a man who loved, he was a man who achieved. Every success was a step on a ladder, every failure a stain to be erased. And when young Barty began to show signs of the same dark talents that had attracted so many to the Death Eaters in his youth, his father did not try to save him. He tried to control him. He tried to hide him. He tried to pretend that his son was not a mirror of the very enemy he was hunting. And that, more than any curse or any torture, is what broke Barty Crouch Jr. By the time he was a teenager, Barty had fallen in with the worst of them. He was at the side of Bellatrix Lestrange, of Rodolphus and Rabastan, of the Lestranges who had already become legends of cruelty. He was a true believer. He did not follow Voldemort for power or for fear. He followed him because the Dark Lord was the first person who ever looked at Barty Crouch and saw a man worth something. The first person who ever looked at him and did not see a failure to be erased. And that fanatical devotion, that desperate need for approval, would lead him to commit the most audacious act of infiltration in the entire history of the wizarding world. After the fall of Voldemort in 1981, the Death Eaters were scattered, many were captured, many went to ground. But Barty Crouch Jr. was one of the few who was actually caught red-handed. He was found alongside Bellatrix and the Lestranges, after they had tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom into madness. And his father, Barty Crouch Sr., the great head of magical law enforcement, was faced with a choice. He could let his son stand trial. He could let the world see that the great crusader against dark magic had raised a monster in his own home. Or he could do what he had always done. He could control the narrative. He could erase the stain. And so Barty Crouch Sr. did something that no father should ever do. He used his power to ensure that his son was not given a trial. He used his influence to ensure that Barty Jr. was sent to Azkaban without ever facing a courtroom. He did not do this to protect the public. He did it to protect his own reputation. He did it to hide the truth that his perfect son was a death. And then he did the worst thing of all. He visited his son in that frozen hell, and he told him that he was dead to the world. He told him that he would rot in Azkaban, that he would never be free, that he was no longer a Crouch. And in that moment, Barty Crouch Jr. did not break. He did not despair. He became something far worse. He became patient. 12 years in Azkaban. 12 years of the Dementor's kiss, of the endless cold, of the memory of his mother's death and his father's betrayal. Most men would have been driven to madness. Barty Crouch Jr. was driven to perfection. He learned to survive the Dementors not by fighting them, but by becoming so empty, so devoid of joy, that they had nothing to feed on. He became a ghost in his own cell. And when his mother, a woman who had loved him despite everything, learned that she was dying, she begged her husband to save their son. And Barty Crouch Sr., the man who had sent his own child to hell, made a deal with the devil. He used his power to stage a death. He used Polyjuice Potion and a dying prisoner to swap his son out of Azkaban. He kept Barty Jr. hidden in his own home, under the Imperius curse, a puppet controlled by his father's wand. For years, the world believed Barty Crouch Jr. was dead, and for years, he lived as a prisoner in his own father's house, a ghost in the home of the man who had condemned him. But the Imperius curse is not a permanent solution. It can be broken by a strong will, by a moment of weakness, by the arrival of a master who has a claim far older than any father's. When the Dark Lord returned, when the Triwizard Tournament was announced, when the opportunity arose to strike at the heart of Hogwarts, Barty Crouch Jr. was ready. He had been waiting for this moment for 12 years. He had been planning for it. And when his father's control slipped, when the old man's guilt and exhaustion made him careless, Barty Jr. struck. He overpowered his father. He took his wand. And then he did something that no one, not even the most paranoid of the Order, could have predicted. He replaced Alastor Moody. The real Alastor Moody was one of the greatest Aurors who ever lived. He was paranoid. He was vigilant. He was the embodiment of the phrase constant vigilance. He had fought Death Eaters for decades, and he had never been caught off guard. But Barty Crouch Jr., the boy who had been raised by the very man who taught the Ministry how to hunt dark wizards, knew Moody better than Moody knew himself. He knew that Moody would never trust a student. He knew that Moody would never accept a gift. He knew that the only way to get close to Harry Potter was to become the one person who was already supposed to be watching him. And so Barty Crouch Jr., using Polyjuice Potion brewed from the real Moody's hair, walked into Hogwarts as the most trusted man in the wizarding world. He taught defense against the dark arts. He taught the students how to resist the Imperius curse. He taught them how to fight dark magic. And all the while, he was the one who was guiding them into the trap. He was the one who put Harry Potter's name into the Goblet of Fire. He was the one who made sure that the Triwizard Tournament would be a path to the graveyard. He was the one who, with his father's own hand, delivered the cup that would become a portkey. And when the moment came, when Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory touched that cup together, Barty Crouch Jr.'s plan was perfect. He had waited for 12 years. He had sacrificed his freedom, his sanity, his very identity. And in that moment, he was the one who brought the Dark Lord back to life. He was the one who killed Cedric Diggory. He was the one who, with his own hands, made sure that the Second War would begin. But here is the true horror of Barty Crouch Jr. He did not do this for power. He did not do this for glory. He did this because he loved Lord Voldemort. He loved him with a devotion that transcended reason, that transcends self-preservation, that transcended even the love of his own family. And when he was finally caught, when he was unmasked by the real Alastor Moody and the Ministry and Dumbledore, he did not beg for mercy. He did not try to escape. He laughed. He laughed because he had succeeded. He laughed because the Dark Lord was alive. And he knew that even if he was sent back to Azkaban, even if he was given the Dementor's kiss, he had done what he was born to do, and that is the fate that awaited him. The Dementor's kiss is not death. It is worse than death. It is the erasure of the soul. It is the removal of every memory, every thought, every feeling that makes a person who they are. Barty Crouch Jr., the perfect infiltrator, the son who was never loved, the man who gave everything for his master, was left as an empty shell. He He was left as a body that breathes, but does not live. He was left as a warning of what happens when you give yourself so completely to a cause that you forget you ever had a self to begin with. And so we close the chapter on Barty Crouch Jr., but we must now turn to a figure who is far more complicated, far more pitiful, and far more terrifying in his own way. Because Barty Crouch Jr. was a fanatic. He was a true believer. But the next man on our list was a coward. He was a rat. And he was the one who, in the end, might have had the only chance at redemption that any Death Eater ever earned. We are talking about Peter Pettigrew, the man who sold his friends for a chance to live. And the question we must ask is this: did he ever deserve the mercy he was shown? The tragedy of Barty Crouch Jr. is a story of fanaticism so absolute that it consumed every last trace of the man he might have become. But even his devotion pales in comparison to the figure we must now examine. A man whose betrayal was so complete, so cowardly, that it set the entire wizarding world on a path toward war. Peter Pettigrew. The name itself is almost a punchline in the halls of magical history. The fat, weepy boy who never quite measured up to his brilliant friends. But to reduce him to mere incompetence is to miss the point entirely. Pettigrew was not a fool. He was a survivor, and survival for him meant choosing the winning side, no matter the cost. Let us begin at the moment that defines his entire existence. The ultimate betrayal of the Potters. James and Lily trusted him. They made him their secret keeper, the one person who held the location of their hidden home in Godric's Hollow. It was a role that should have been filled by Sirius Black, but Sirius, in a moment of misguided cleverness, suggested they switch. He thought it would be safer that Voldemort would come after him, leaving the Potters hidden. Instead, he handed the keys to the kingdom to a rat. Pettigrew did not hesitate. He went straight to the Dark Lord, whispered the address, and then vanished into the shadows as the killing curse lit up that cottage. He did not even stay to watch the aftermath. He simply ran, and for 13 years he hid, not in some distant country, not under a glamour or a polyjuice potion, but as a rat, Scabbers, the pet of the Weasley family. Think about the sheer audacity of that choice. He chose to live as a vermin, gnawing on scraps, sleeping in a boy's pocket, enduring the indignity of being handled by children. It was the ultimate act of self-abasement, and yet it was also the perfect camouflage. Who would ever suspect that the pudgy, trembling rat belonging to Percy Weasley was one of the most wanted men in the wizarding world? He spent those years listening, waiting, and above all, staying alive. He was a ghost in the walls of the burrow, a silent witness to the lives of the family, whose son he would one day betray again. But the past has a way of surfacing. When Sirius Black escaped Azkaban, the hunt began. Pettigrew knew his time as Scabbers was running out. He could feel the heat closing in, and when Sirius finally cornered him in the Shrieking Shack, the mask of the timid rat fell away. He begged, he wept, he grovelled. He reminded Remus Lupin of their school days, of the friendship they had once shared. It was a masterclass in pathetic manipulation, and it almost worked. But then came the moment that sealed his fate. He did not repent. He did not confess out of guilt. He confessed only because he was caught. And when the opportunity arose, he escaped again, slipping away into the darkness, leaving Sirius to fall through the veil. And so he returned to his master. The rebirth of the Dark Lord required a servant, and Pettigrew was the one who answered the call. He found Voldemort in that Albanian forest, a wretched, bodiless spirit clinging to existence, and he did not hesitate. He fed him, he protected him, and he orchestrated the entire ritual that would give him a new body. It was Pettigrew who captured Harry Potter, who tied him to the gravestone, who cut his own hand to add blood to the cauldron, and as a reward, Voldemort gave him a new hand, a silver hand powerful and strong, a replacement for the flesh he had sacrificed. But that hand was more than a gift. It was a tether. It was a leash. It was a constant reminder that Pettigrew's life was no longer his own. He could not betray Voldemort again, because that hand would kill him if he did. It was a magical suicide bomb, worn openly on his wrist. For years, Pettigrew served. He was a nursemaid to a monster, a cook and a cleaner for the most feared wizard in history. Endured the contempt of the other Death Eaters, the sneers of Bellatrix Lestrange, the cold indifference of Lucius Malfoy. He was the lowest of the low, a worm in a world of snakes. And yet, he stayed, because staying meant survival. He had no other path. But then came Malfoy Manor. Harry Potter and Ron Weasley were captured, dragged into the drawing room, and Pettigrew was ordered to check their wands. He approached, and for a moment, he was just the rat again, trembling, eager to please. But something happened. Harry spoke. He reminded Pettigrew of a debt, a life debt, owed for sparing his own life in the Shrieking Shack. It was a thread of mercy, a tiny crack in the armour of cowardice, and for one fleeting second, Pettigrew hesitated. He did not attack. He did not scream for his master. He just stopped, and that hesitation was enough. The silver hand, that beautiful, terrible gift from Voldemort, recognized the betrayal before it could fully form. It tightened around Pettigrew's throat, oaking the life from him. It was not a punishment. It was a failsafe. Voldemort had built a weapon into his most loyal servant, a weapon that would ensure he could never waver. And in that moment, Pettigrew did not die a hero. He did not die a villain. He died a rat, strangled by his own master's generosity. It was the most fitting end for a man who had spent his entire life running from the consequences of his choices. Peter Pettigrew's story is not one of redemption. It is a cautionary tale about the cost of cowardice. He could have been brave. He could have stood with his friends. But he chose fear, and fear consumed him. His silver hand was a symbol of his servitude, a constant reminder that he had traded his soul for a few more years of breath. And in the end, even that breath was taken from him by the very power he had tried so desperately to serve. But there is another figure whose story is far more complex. A man who walked the line between light and dark, with a precision that fooled even the greatest wizard of the age. A man whose loyalty was questioned until the very end, and whose true allegiance was only revealed in a single, devastating memory. That man is Severus Snape, and his gambit is the most dangerous game of all. We ended the last chapter with Peter Pettigrew, the rat who chose cowardice over redemption, his silver hand, a constant reminder of the master he served. But if Pettigrew was the betrayer who crawled back to Voldemort, then Severus Snape was the traitor who never truly left, or so the world believed. And that is the heart of the most complex double-agent mission in magical history. To understand Severus Snape, you have to strip away the black robes and the sneer, and look at the boy from Spinner's End. He was born into poverty, into a home where the shouting never stopped, where his muggle father's temper was as unpredictable as the weather, and he found solace in a world that made sense. Magic. He met Lily Evans on a swing set, and for a brief shining moment, he believed he had found a friend who saw him. But the world of magic was not kind to a half-blood boy with a taste for the dark arts. At Hogwarts, he was sorted into Slytherin, and he fell in with the wrong crowd. Mulciber, Avery, and the future Death Eaters, who promised power and belonging. He called Lily a mudblood in a moment of shame, and that word severed the only bond that mattered. So when Voldemort rose, Snape was ready. He took the dark mark. He became a Death Eater. He whispered secrets and brewed poisons, and he believed he had found his purpose. But then the prophecy came. He overheard the fragment, the one about a boy born at the end of July, and he carried it to his master. He did not know it would target Lily. When he realized the Dark Lord intended to kill her, he begged. He went to Dumbledore, and he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He switched sides, not for the greater good, not for the wizarding world, but for a green-eyed girl who had once been his only friend. And that is where the burden of the traitor label begins. From that moment, Snape was a double agent, but he was also a man condemned to live a lie. Dumbledore trusted him, but no one else did. The Order of the Phoenix looked at him with suspicion. The Death Eaters, after Voldemort's fall, branded him a deserter. He was caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. He spent years teaching at Hogwarts, protecting Harry Potter from a distance, all while enduring the hatred of the boy who had his mother's eyes. Every sneer from Harry, every accusation of cowardice, was a knife he had to swallow in silence. Then came the vow to Dumbledore. It was not a simple promise. It was a binding magical contract, sworn on his own life. Dumbledore, already dying from the curse on his hand, knew his time was short. He asked Snape to do the unthinkable, to kill him, to murder the headmaster of Hogwarts, the only person who knew the truth, and Snape agreed. He agreed because Dumbledore told him it was necessary, that it would cement his place as Voldemort's most trusted servant, that it would allow him to continue protecting Harry from the inside. But the cost was his soul. When the moment came, on the Astronomy Tower, with Draco Malfoy trembling and unable to finish the task, Snape raised his wand. He looked into Dumbledore's eyes, and he saw the old man's calm acceptance. He whispered the curse, and Dumbledore fell. The world saw a traitor. The Order saw a murderer. Harry saw the man who killed his mentor, and Snape had to carry that weight, knowing he could never explain, never defend himself, never let anyone see the truth. He fled Hogwarts, and he returned to Voldemort's side. He became the headmaster of the school he had once called home, turning it into a prison for the children he was supposed to protect. He watched as the Carrows tortured students, as the castle fell into darkness, and he did nothing to stop it, because he could not. Every act of cruelty he allowed was a scar on his own conscience. He was the most hated man in the wizarding world, and he had to stay that way. But the end was coming. Voldemort, in his paranoia, believed that Snape was the master of the Elder Wand. He summoned him to the Shrieking Shack, and without a word, he set Nagini on him. The snake struck, and Snape fell, his blood pooling on the floor. And in those final moments, as the life drained from him, Harry arrived. Snape looked at him, and he saw Lily. He gave Harry his memories, a torrent of truth that poured into the pensieve, and that is where the vindication of his soul comes. Through Harry's eyes, the real Severus Snape, the boy who loved Lily, who protected her son for 17 years, who carried the weight of a double-agent mission without ever breaking, the vow he made to Dumbledore, the murder he committed out of mercy, the burden of the traitor label he wore like a shroud, and the final truth, he was never a traitor. He was the bravest man Harry ever knew. When Harry walked into the forest to face Voldemort, he carried Snape's memories with him. He understood the sacrifice. He understood that the man he had hated for so long had loved him in the only way he could. From the shadows, in silence, through a lifetime of pain. And in that understanding, Snape's soul was finally free. But the story of the Death Eaters does not end with Snape's redemption. There is another figure, a man of wealth and influence, who played a far more complicated game. He was the face of the old aristocracy, a man who bowed to Voldemort but always kept one hand on his own power. He survived the war, but at a cost that would strip him of everything he valued. His name is Lucius Malfoy, and his fall from grace is a story of pride, loss, and the price of choosing the wrong side. The previous chapter left us with Severus Snape, a man who played a role so complex that even those closest to him could not see the full picture until it was far too late. But now we turn to a very different kind of Death Eater, a man who did not seek redemption, who did not play a double game for the greater good, a man who believed with every fibre of his being that his wealth, his name and his blood status would protect him from the consequences of his choices. This is the story of Lucius Malfoy and the slow, agonizing fall of an aristocracy that thought it was untouchable. To understand Lucius Malfoy, you have to understand the world he was born into. The Malfoy name was not just old money, it was ancient power. For centuries, the Malfoys had navigated the treacherous waters of wizarding society, always landing on the right side of power, always with their galleons and their influence intact. They were not like the Lestranges, who wore their dark allegiance like a crown. The Malfoys were subtle, they were patient, they pulled strings from the shadows, and they never got their hands dirty unless absolutely necessary. Lucius was the perfect heir to this legacy. handsome, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He moved through the ministry corridors with the ease of a man who knew that laws were suggestions for other people. He donated to the right charities, he whispered in the right ears, and he built a reputation as a respectable, if slightly intimidating, member of the elite. But beneath that polished exterior, Lucius was a true believer. He did not join Voldemort out of fear or coercion. He joined because he saw in the Dark Lord a mirror of his own ambitions, a world where pure bloods ruled, where the Muggles and the Muggle-borns were put in their proper place, and where the old families like his own would finally be given the deference they deserved. For years, this alliance served him well. During the First Wizarding War, Lucius was one of Voldemort's most valuable assets. He provided funding, he provided connections, and he provided a veneer of respectability to a movement that was otherwise built on terror and violence. He was the Dark Lord's right hand in the Ministry, a position of immense power and influence. And then Voldemort fell. The night at Godric's Hollow shattered everything. The Dark Lord was gone, and his followers were left to scramble for cover. But Lucius Malfoy did not scramble. He did not flee. He did exactly what a Malfoy was supposed to do. He lied. He charmed. He paid the right people. He claimed he had been under the Imperius curse, a convenient excuse that many Death Eaters used, but few had the resources to make stick. Lucius walked away from the war with his freedom, his fortune, and his reputation largely intact. He even managed to get a seat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. He was the perfect example of how the old aristocracy could survive any storm, as long as they had the right connections and enough gold. But the storm was not over. It was only gathering strength. And when Voldemort returned, Lucius was the first to be called back into service. This time, however, things were different. The Dark Lord had spent 13 years as a wraith, a disembodied spirit clinging to existence through sheer hatred. He had not forgotten the followers who had abandoned him. He had not forgotten the ones who had claimed the Imperius curse, who had denied him, who had tried to rebuild their lives as if he had never existed. And Lucius Malfoy, the man who had once been his most valuable lieutenant, was now a target of his master's contempt. The first sign of this shift came at the Quidditch World Cup, when Lucius's son, Draco, was drawn into a confrontation with Harry Potter. But the real turning point was the mission to the Department of Mysteries. Voldemort sent Lucius and a group of Death Eaters to retrieve a prophecy that could have given the Dark Lord the key to defeating Harry Potter once and for all. It was a mission of the highest importance, and Lucius was put in charge. This was his chance to prove his loyalty, to reclaim his position at the right hand of the Dark Lord, and he failed, spectacularly. The battle in the Department of Mysteries was a disaster. The Death Eaters were outmaneuvered by a group of teenagers. The prophecy was destroyed, and Lucius was captured, along with most of his companions. He was sent to Azkaban, the very prison he had so narrowly avoided after the First War. For a man who had built his entire identity on being untouchable, on being above the law, this was a humiliation beyond measure. But it was not the worst of it. The worst was what happened when he was broken out of Azkaban, when Voldemort's followers stormed the prison and freed the prisoners. Lucius returned to his master, expecting to be welcomed back into the fold. Instead, he was met with cold, seething contempt. Voldemort did not kill him. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he made Lucius watch as his home. Malfoy Manor was turned into the headquarters of the Death Eater operation. The grand drawing room, where Lucius had once hosted ministry officials and pure blood elites, was now a gathering place for murderers and torturers. The chandeliers that had cost a fortune were now lit by the eerie glow of the Dark Mark, and Lucius, the master of the house, was reduced to a servant. He was no longer the Dark Lord's right hand. He was a failure, a disappointment, a man who had been given every advantage and had squandered it all. This is where the true fall of Lucius Malfoy, the transition from the Dark Lord's right hand to a disgraced, fearful shell of a man, He walks through his own halls, with his head bowed, avoiding the eyes of the other Death Eaters. He flinches when Voldemort speaks. He is no longer the confident, arrogant aristocrat. He is a man who has seen the consequences of his choices, and he is terrified. The occupation of Malfoy Manor is not just a physical invasion, it is a psychological dismantling. Every room, every piece of furniture, every memory of his former life is now a reminder of how far he has fallen. And yet, even in this state of utter degradation, something begins to shift within Lucius. It is not a moral awakening. He does not suddenly see the error of his ways, but he does begin to see the cost. He looks at his son Draco, who has been forced into a mission he cannot possibly complete. A mission to kill Albus Dumbledore. He looks at his wife, Narcissa, who is terrified for their son's life. And for the first time, Lucius Malfoy realizes that his loyalty to the Dark Lord has brought him nothing but pain. His desire to protect his family ultimately outweighed his loyalty to the Death Eater cause. It is a slow, painful realization, but it is real. This becomes most clear during the Battle of Hogwarts. When Voldemort orders the Death Eaters to fight, Lucius does not charge forward with the same fanaticism as Bellatrix. He hesitates. He looks for his family. He tries to find a way out. And when the tide of the battle turns, when Voldemort is finally defeated, Lucius does not fight to the death. He does not try to avenge his master. He simply stops. He drops his wand. He surrenders. It is not a heroic act. It is not a redemption. It is the final, desperate act of a man who has finally understood that his entire life has been built on a lie. After the war, Lucius Malfoy faced the Wizengamot once again, but this time, he did not have the same power to charm his way out. His fortune was diminished. His name was tarnished. His influence was gone. He was sentenced to a period of house arrest, a punishment that was, in many ways, more humiliating than Azkaban. He was confined to the very manor that had been taken from him, forced to live with the memories of what he had done and what he had lost. He was no longer a threat. He was no longer a player in the game of wizarding politics. He was just a broken man, living in the ruins of his former glory. But there is one more story to tell before we leave the Malfoy family behind. So while Lucius was the face of the family's fall, there was another who navigated the same treacherous waters with a very different approach. A woman who was not marked, who was not a Death Eater in the formal sense, but who was just as deeply entangled in the web of Voldemort's war. She was the one who made the choice that saved her family, the one who lied to the Dark Lord's face and got away with it. Her name was Narcissa Malfoy, and her story is one of quiet, desperate courage. That is what we will explore in the next chapter. In the shadow of Lucius Malfoy's collapse from the Dark Lord's right hand to a broken, fearful man, there stood a figure who never bore the dark mark, yet wielded more influence than many who did. Her name was Narcissa Malfoy, and her story is one of the most quietly subversive in the entire war. She was not a Death Eater in the formal sense. There was no brand seared into her left forearm, no summons that burned through her skin when Voldemort touched the mark of a follower. And yet, within the gilded halls of Malfoy Manor, she commanded a power that even Bellatrix Lestrange, for all her fanaticism, could not fully match. To understand Narcissa is to understand the weight of a name like Malfoy. She married into one of the oldest pure-blood dynasties, a family that had long used wealth and influence as weapons, but where Lucius wielded his status openly, striding through the ministry with his cane and his sneer, Narcissa operated from the shadows of the manor's drawing rooms. She was the keeper of the family's social standing, the one who whispered warnings at Gallus, who read between the lines of every invitation and every slight. In a movement that worshipped blood purity, she was the living embodiment of that ideal, pristine, untouchable, and utterly devoted to her son. And it was that devotion that would become her most dangerous weapon. When Draco was given the impossible task of killing Albus Dumbledore, Narcissa did not accept it as her husband did. With bowed head and trembling hands, she acted. She sought out Severus Snape in the cold, fog-bound garden of Malfoy Manor and there she forced upon him an unbreakable vow. The magic of that bond was absolute, a chain of life and death. She made Snape swear to protect Draco, to complete his mission if he failed, and to guard the Malfoy heir with his own life. It was a gamble that defied the Dark Lord's orders, a silent rebellion born, not from loyalty to Voldemort, but from the fierce, unyielding love of a mother. The unbreakable vow was Narcissa's first open act of defiance, but it was not her last. The most crucial moment came in the heart of the Forbidden Forest, when the war hung on a single lie. Voldemort had cast the killing curse at Harry Potter, and the boy had fallen, but he was not dead. Narcissa was sent to confirm the death, to touch the boy's pulse and verify the end. She knelt there in the damp leaves, the Dark Lord hovering behind her, and she felt the steady beat of Harry's heart beneath her fingers. In that instant, she made a choice that would reshape the war's final moments. She looked up at Voldemort and said coldly, clearly, that the boy was dead. She lied, because the only thing she wanted more than victory for the Dark Lord was to see her own son safe, to know that Draco could be retrieved from the chaos, and that they could escape. Her love for her family outweighed her fear of the most powerful wizard alive. That single lie broke Voldemort's confidence. It sent him striding toward the castle, convinced of his invincibility, and it set in motion the final confrontation. Narcissa Malfoy, the unmarked ally, had turned the tide with nothing more than a whisper. After the war, when the surviving Death Eaters were rounded up and the trials began, the Malfoys faced a peculiar fate. Lucius stood before the Wizengamot, stripped of his influence, his wealth diminished, but alive. Narcissa's act of defiance was known to the Order. Harry himself spoke on their behalf, testifying that she had saved his life, and so they walked free. But they did not walk back into the world they had once ruled. They retreated quietly from the public eye. Malfoy Manor, once the seat of Dark Lord's command, grew silent. The peacocks roamed the grounds. The chandeliers remained unlit. Narcissa and Lucius withdrew into a muted, private existence, their only comfort the safety of their son. She never took the dark mark. She never needed to. Her power was not in the brand on her arm, but in the choices she made when no one was watching. In the end, it was the unmarked ally, the mother who lied to the most dangerous wizard in history, who did more to bring about his fall than many who bore his mark. And yet not all families who served Voldemort were so fortunate. The Carrows, brother and sister, Amicus and Alecto, embraced their roles with a brutality that left no room for quiet defiance. They brought terror to the very heart of Hogwarts, turning the school into a prison of fear. Their story is one of raw, unfiltered cruelty, and it is coming next. Narcissa Malfoy's defiance in the Forbidden Forest was a silent earthquake, a crack in the foundation of Voldemort's absolute control. She chose her son over her master, and in that choice, she betrayed the very ideology she had spent her life upholding. But while the Dark Lord was blind to her deception in that critical moment, he was not blind to the need for absolute authority elsewhere. And nowhere did he need that authority more than at Hogwarts, the seat of magical education, the place where the next generation of witches and wizards would either be bent to his will or resist him forever. To ensure loyalty, he installed two of his most vicious servants as professors, twin terrors who would turn the school into a house of fear. Their names were Amicus and Alecto Carrow, and their reign during the 1997-98 school year would become one of the darkest chapters in Hogwarts history. The Carrow siblings were not subtle. They did not employ psychological manipulation or political maneuvering like Lucius Malfoy. They used brute force, cruelty, and the systematic degradation of every student who crossed their path. Amicus, the brother, was appointed as the new defense against the dark arts teacher, though the title was a grotesque mockery. In truth, he taught the dark arts themselves, making the subject mandatory for every student from first years to 7th years. Gone were lessons on defensive spells, shielding charms, and protective enchantments. Instead, students were forced to practice the Cruciatus curse on one another, to memorize the properties of cursed objects, to learn how to summon fiend fire and brew poisons. If a student refused, Amicus would punish them with his own wand, often leaving them in physical agony on the classroom floor. Alecto, the sister, took over Muggle studies, but her curriculum was not about understanding non-magical folk. It was a propaganda machine, teaching that Muggles were vermin, that Muggle-born stole magic, and that the pure blood way was the only righteous path. She revelled in humiliation, making students recite slogans of blood purity or face detention in the dungeons with the trolls. Together, the Carrows turned Hogwarts into a prison. They patrolled the corridors at night, their voices echoing off the stone walls, their wands always drawn. They punished any act of rebellion with brutal efficiency. Students were dragged from their common rooms, forced to kneel in the Great Hall, subjected to the Imperius curse as a lesson. The torture was not reserved for rule breakers. It was a constant threat, a cloud that hung over every meal, every class, every quiet moment in the common room. Neville Longbottom, whose parents had been tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange, became a particular target. He resisted the Carrows openly, and they repaid him with beatings and curses that left him bruised and shaken. But Neville was not alone. The staff, what remained of them, worked in secret to protect the students. Professor McGonagall was forced to watch as her school was defiled, but she could not act openly, not while Snape was headmaster, and the Carrows held the power of life and death. The turning point came during the final battle, and Harry Potter returned to Hogwarts. The Carrows had been tasked with capturing students to use as hostages, and Alecto was stationed in the Ravenclaw common room, waiting for Harry to arrive. But Harry came with allies, and the siblings' arrogance proved their undoing. In the chaos of the battle, they were swiftly defeated. Amicus was cornered in the Ravenclaw tower, and when he spat on Professor McGonagall, it was Harry who cast the Cruciatus curse on him. A rare moment of anger that broke the wizard's composure. Alecto was stunned and bound. Together, they were imprisoned in the dungeons, stripped of their wands, left to await the outcome of the war they had helped to perpetuate. Their terror was over, but the scars they left on the students would not heal easily. The Carrows' downfall was swift, but their legacy reminds us that the most dangerous Death Eaters are not always the ones who wield power from a throne. Sometimes, they are the ones who teach the next generation how to hate. And while the siblings were locked away, another Death Eater was tightening his grip on the Ministry itself, pulling strings from behind the scenes, orchestrating a puppet government that served the Dark Lord's every whim. That man was Corbin Yaxley, and his story is one of manipulation, infiltration, and the quiet erosion of freedom itself. The Carrow siblings had turned Hogwarts into a fortress of fear, but their work was merely the visible surface of a much deeper rot. While Amicus and Alecto terrorized the student body from within the castle walls, another Death Eater was executing a far more insidious plan, one that would deliver the entire Ministry of Magic into Voldemort's hands without a single battle fought in the atrium. That man was Corbin Yaxley, and his story is the story of how a government fell from the inside. You see, Voldemort understood something that his more brutish followers often failed to grasp. Terror alone could not hold a nation. You could torture and kill, but eventually the population would rise up, or the ministry would be forced to act. True control required something far more elegant, the appearance of legitimacy, and for that, you needed a puppet. You needed a figurehead who looked, sounded, and acted like the Minister for Magic, while every decision he made was whispered into his ear by the Dark Lord. That was the role Pius Thickness was destined to play, and Corbin Yaxley was the man who would put him on the stage. Yaxley was not the loudest Death Eater. He did not have Bellatrix's theatrical madness or Lucius Malfoy's aristocratic charm. He was something far more dangerous, a pragmatist. He was a man who understood the levers of power, the bureaucratic machinery that kept the wizarding world running. While others dreamed of destruction, Yaxley dreamed of control. And his greatest achievement, the one act that arguably did more to secure Voldemort's victory than any single battle, was his infiltration of the Ministry of Magic and his successful placement of Pious Thickness under the Imperius curse. The plan was executed with surgical precision. Yaxley, using his connections and his cunning, managed to get close to Thickness, who was then the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It was a position of immense authority, but Thickness was at his core a bureaucrat. He was not a warrior. He was a man who believed in order, in procedure, in the proper chain of command, and that made him vulnerable. One evening, in a quiet corridor or a private office, Yaxley cornered him. The Imperius curse is one of the unforgivables, requiring immense willpower and a cold, focused intent. Yaxley had that in abundance. He looked Pious Thickness in the eye, spoke the incantation, and just like that, the future Minister for Magic became a hollow shell, a walking puppet, whose strings led directly back to the Dark Lord. From that moment on, the Ministry was compromised at its highest level. When Rufus Scrimgeour fell, when the Ministry finally collapsed under the weight of Voldemort's assault, it was Pious Thickness who was installed as the figurehead minister. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Thickness was a puppet, and the man holding the strings, the man who stood beside him in every official photograph, the man who ensured that every decree, every law, every act of tyranny was carried out without question, was Corbin Yaxley. Yaxley was rewarded with the position he had always coveted. He became the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. During the regime's peak, think about the terrifying significance of that. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was not just some administrative office. It was the heart of the Ministry's authority. It oversaw the Aurors, the Hit Wizards, the entire apparatus of magical justice. And now it was run by a Death Eater who answered only to Voldemort. Yaxley was not just a soldier anymore. He was the law. He was the one who decided who was a Muggle-born, who was a blood traitor, who was an enemy of the New Order. He signed the warrants. He authorized the raids. He made the entire machinery of the Ministry grind in the direction of Voldemort's will. Under his command, the Ministry became a weapon of pure oppression. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was not some rogue operation. It was a formal department, operating with the full weight of the law behind it, and Yaxley was its enforcer. He sat in judgment. He condemned families. He tore children from their parents, all while wearing the robes of a Ministry official. He was the perfect administrator for a regime of terror, because he never saw it as terror. He saw it as order. He saw it as the proper functioning of a society that had finally been cleansed of impurity. But Yaxley's power, like all power built on a lie, was fragile. It depended entirely on the continued strength of the Dark Lord. And when Voldemort's army marched on Hogwarts, when the final battle was joined, Yaxley had no choice but to leave his desk and take up his wand. He was a Death Eater, after all. The dark mark on his arm burned with the summons, and he could not refuse. The final duel in the Great Hall was a chaotic, desperate melee. The air was thick with spells, with screams, with the smell of smoke and blood. Yaxley fought alongside the other high-ranking lieutenants, those who had been with Voldemort from the beginning, or who had risen to prominence in the final year. He was not a duelist of Bellatrix caliber, but he was competent, ruthless, and determined. He had come too far, seized too much power, to let it all slip away now. But the tide had turned. Voldemort's army was breaking. The Order of the Phoenix, the students, the teachers, the very spirit of Hogwarts itself, was pushing back. And then the final blow was struck. Voldemort fell. The Dark Lord was dead. And in that instant, the entire structure of terror that Yaxley had helped build came crashing down around him. The accounts of his final moments are brief. He was overpowered, disarmed, and taken down. He collapsed alongside the other high-ranking lieutenants, his body hitting the stone floor of the Great Hall as the cheers of the victors rose around him. He did not die in a blaze of glory. He did not make a last stand. He simply fell, a puppet master whose strings had been cut, leaving him nothing more than a broken man on a cold floor. Corbin Yaxley's story is a warning. It is a reminder that the most dangerous enemies are not always the ones who wield the most destructive magic. Sometimes, the most dangerous enemy is the one who understands how the system works, who is willing to quietly, patiently corrupt it from within. He nearly succeeded. He almost delivered the entire wizarding world into the hands of a tyrant, not through battle, but through bureaucracy. But even the most carefully laid plans can be undone. And for Yaxley, the end came not in a ministry office, but in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, surrounded by the rubble of the empire he had helped to build. And speaking of those who fought on the front lines, who wielded destruction rather than bureaucracy, our next chapter turns to a Death Eater of a very different kind, a man whose name became synonymous with brutal, reckless violence, and whose actions in a certain Muggle cafe in London nearly changed the course of the war. We will explore the fiery chaos of Thorfinn Roll and the attack on Tottenham Court Road. Corbin Yaxley had just secured the Ministry of Magic under the Dark Lord's thumb. He placed Pius Thickness under the Imperius curse and became the de facto head of magical law enforcement, turning the very apparatus of government into a weapon against Harry Potter. That was a triumph of subtlety, of infiltration, of political manoeuvring. But not every Death Eater works in shadows. Some are built for brute force, for the kind of raw violence that leaves no room for doubt. Thorfinn Roll was one of those. Roll was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with a face that seemed perpetually twisted into a sneer. He was not known for cunning or strategy. He was the kind of Death Eater you sent when you wanted a building demolished or a crowd scattered. And in the summer of 1997, the Dark Lord gave him a mission that seemed straightforward. Hunt down Harry Potter in London. The attack on Tottenham Court Road came just days after Harry, Ron and Hermione had fled from Bill and Fleur's wedding. The trio had apparated into a shabby London alley, hoping to blend into the Muggle crowd while they figured out their next move. But they had barely stepped into the street when a deafening crack announced the arrival of two Death Eaters. Thorfinn Roll and Antonin Dolohov had been patrolling the area, tipped off by the Ministry's new tracking capabilities. They found their targets not through clever deduction, but through sheer proximity and aggression. Roll didn't hesitate. He raised his wand and unleashed a torrent of flame that set a nearby shopfront ablaze. Muggles screamed and scattered. The street erupted into chaos. This was not a subtle capture attempt. This was a sledgehammer. Roll wanted to corner the trio, to blast them into submission with sheer firepower. He cast a killing curse that missed Ron by inches, and then a blasting curse that ripped a crater into the pavement. The attack was brutally direct, but it was also reckless. In the confined space of a Muggle street, surrounded by innocent bystanders and vulnerable civilians, Roll's approach was a liability. Harry, Ron and Hermione fought back. They used defensive spells and desperate misdirection. Hermione cast a Confundus charm that sent a pair of Muggles stumbling into Rowl's path. Ron disarmed Dolohov with a well-aimed Expelliarmus, and then in the chaos, Harry cast a shield charm so powerful it repelled Roll's next curse and sent him staggering backward. The Death Eaters were forced to disapparate, leaving their quarry alive and free. The failure was absolute. Not only had Rowell and Dolohov failed to capture Harry Potter, but they had also exposed Death Eater activity to the Muggle world, forcing the Ministry to issue a cover story about a gas leak. Voldemort's patience was not infinite. When Rowell and Dolohov returned to Malfoy Manor, the Dark Lord was waiting. The penalty for failure was not a reprimand or a demotion. It was the Cruciatus Curse. In the presence of his inner circle, Voldemort demonstrated that even his most loyal warriors were expendable if they disappointed him. He raised his wand and whispered the incantation. Rowell fell to the floor, writhing and screaming, his muscles contorted in agony. It was not a punishment meant to kill. It was a motivational tool, a reminder that fear was the only currency that mattered. Rowell learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible. He would not fail again. But his story does not end with that one defeat. Roll was present at the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, when the Death Eaters infiltrated Hogwarts to aid Draco Malfoy's assassination attempt on Albus Dumbledore. He was among the masked figures who fought their way up the spiral staircase, exchanging curses with members of the Order of the Phoenix. In the chaos of that night, Roll contributed his brute strength to the assault, but he was outmatched by the likes of Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks. He survived the battle, though, and continued to serve the Dark Lord through the occupation of the Ministry and the hunt for Harry Potter. His Thorfinn Rowell's failure on Tottenham Court Road was a costly one, but he was not the only Death Eater whose incompetence was met with the Dark Lord's wrath. In fact, the pattern of failure and punishment reveals something deeper about Voldemort's inner circle. The sons often paid for the sins of the fathers, and the fathers in turn shaped the sons into instruments of their own destruction. This brings us to two figures who are almost always mentioned together, yet whose individual stories are rarely told. Crabbe and Goyle Sr., the fathers who stood beside Voldemort in the First War and whose legacy would ultimately consume their children in the Second. To understand the elder Crabbe and Goyle, we must first understand the world they came from. They were not the architects of Voldemort's ideology, but they were at most loyal foot soldiers. In the First Wizarding War, when the Death Eaters operated in the shadows, committing murders, torturing Muggleborns, and spreading terror, Crabbe and Goyle were the muscle. They were the ones who carried out the orders that more cunning Death Eaters, like Lucius Malfoy or Severus Snape, might have avoided. They were not thinkers, they were enforcers, and in a movement built on fear, that made them invaluable. But when Voldemort fell at Godric's Hollow in 1981, the elder Crabbe and Goyle did what so many of their comrades did. They retreated into the shadows. They denied their involvement. They claimed they had been under the Imperius curse, just as Lucius Malfoy would later do. And because they were not among the most high-profile Death Eaters, because they had not been caught in the act of murdering prominent figures, they escaped Azkaban. They returned to their lives, to their families, and to their sons. And this is where the story of the elder Crabbe and Goyle becomes truly tragic, because they did not simply abandon the Dark Lord's cause. They passed it on. They raised their sons, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle, to be the next generation of Death Eaters. They taught them to hate Muggleborns, to revere pure blood supremacy, and to follow the lead of the Malfoy family. They sent them to Hogwarts not to learn, but to serve. And when Voldemort returned in 1995, the elder Crabbe and Goyle were among the first to answer his call. In the Second War, the elder Crabbe and Goyle resumed their roles as enforcers. They were present at the Battle of the Department of Mysteries. They were part of the larger force that Voldemort assembled, the faceless ranks that carried out his will. But their true influence was felt not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Hogwarts, because their sons, Vincent and Gregory, were there, and they were doing exactly what their fathers had raised them to do. Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle were not the brightest students at Hogwarts. In fact, they were often portrayed as little more than Draco Malfoy's henchmen, following his orders without question. But that portrayal misses the point. They were not followers of Draco Malfoy. They were followers of their fathers, and their fathers had taught them that loyalty to the Malfoy family was loyalty to the Dark Lord. So, when Draco was given the task of killing Albus Dumbledore, Crabbe and Goyle were there to support him. When the Death Eaters took over Hogwarts in 1997, Crabbe and Goyle were there to enforce the new regime. They were the next generation of terror, shaped by the hands of the previous one. But the legacy of the elder Crabbe and Goyle did not end with their son's service. It ended with their son's destruction. And that destruction came in the most spectacular and tragic way imaginable. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Vincent Crabbe, Gregory Goyle, and Draco Malfoy found themselves in the Room of Requirement, chasing after Harry Potter. But Vincent Crabbe driven by a desire to prove himself, unleashed a spell he could not control. He cast Fiend Fire, a cursed fire that consumes everything in its path. The fire spread rapidly, devouring the room and everything inside it. Draco and Gregory escaped on brooms, but Vincent Crabbe did not. He was consumed by the very fire he had summoned. The Crabbe line ended in a blaze of his own making. And what of the Elder Goyle? After the war, he simply disappeared. He was not captured, not killed, not tried. He vanished into the shadows, just as he had done after the First War. Perhaps he is still out there, living in obscurity, carrying the weight of his son's survival and his own failures. Or perhaps he met the same fate as so many other Death Eaters, dying alone and unmourned. The wizarding world does not know, and perhaps it does not care. But the story of the Elder Crabbe and Goyle is not just a story of two men. It is a story of legacy. It is a story of how the sins of the fathers are passed down to the sons, and how those sins can consume everything in their path. The Elder Crabbe and Goyle were not the masterminds of Voldemort's regime. They were not the strategists or the spies, but they were the foundation upon which the next generation of Death Eaters was built. And when that foundation crumbled, it took their children with it. This brings us to another father whose legacy would shape the Second War in ways both subtle and devastating. A man who, unlike Crabbe and Goyle, was not content to simply follow orders. A man who believed that pure blood supremacy was not just a cause, but a directory of names, a ledger of worth. That man was not Senior, and his story is one of quiet influence and dark ambition. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. We ended the last chapter with the fathers of Crabbe and Goyle, men who raised their sons to be blunt instruments of the Dark Lord's will. But not every Death Eater legacy was built on brute force. Some families wielded a far more dangerous weapon, intellect, and among Voldemort's inner circle, few names carried the weight of the Knots. The Knot family was ancient, their lineage stretching back centuries, and their name was synonymous with a particular kind of pure blood supremacy, one that valued knowledge over violence. While Lucius Malfoy charmed his way through ministry corridors and Bellatrix Lestrange screamed curses in battle, Knot Senior operated in the shadows of academia and arcane law. He was not a man who needed to raise his wand to make his presence felt. His power came from what he knew, and more importantly, from what he could prove. This intellectual weight was precisely what drew Tom Riddle to the Knot family during his early years of recruitment. Before he was Lord Voldemort, for the masks and the dark marks, Tom Riddle was a brilliant, ambitious young man who understood that true power required more than just magical might. It required information, and the Knot family, with their vast private libraries and generations of accumulated dark knowledge, were walking repositories of secrets. Knot Senior did not merely pledge allegiance to Riddle. He became a curator of the Dark Lord's most dangerous archives. The Pure Blood Directory was Knot's greatest contribution to the cause. It was not a simple list of names and blood statuses. It was a meticulously researched genealogy of every significant wizarding family in Britain, tracing marriages, inheritances, and hidden scandals back through the centuries. Knot had compiled it over decades, cross-referencing ministry records, family grimoires, and even Muggle birth registries. He knew who was truly pure, who had Muggle blood hidden 3 generations back, and who could be blackmailed into loyalty. The directory was leverage, and Knot guarded it like a dragon hoarding gold. When Voldemort fell in 1981, Knot did what any intelligent man would do. He disappeared into his estate, burned what he could not carry, and waited. The ministry never found enough evidence to hold him, and the Pure Blood Directory remained hidden, a silent testament to the network of influence that still existed beneath the surface of wizarding society. For over a decade, Knot bided his time, watching, waiting, and ensuring that the family name remained untarnished while he quietly preserved the Dark Lord's intellectual legacy. When the Dark Mark burned again in 1995, Nott answered the call without hesitation. He was older now, his hair grey and his face lined with years of careful patience, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He returned to Voldemort's side not as a soldier, but as an archivist and strategist. He knew the weaknesses of ministry officials, the debts of prominent families, and the bloodlines that could be manipulated. In the war room of Malfoy Manor, Nott's voice was often the quietest, but it was always the most listened to. Then came the Department of Mysteries. The battle in the Hall of Prophecy was a disaster for the Death Eaters. 11 of the 12 who entered were captured, and only Bellatrix Lestrange escaped. Nott was among the fallen, but his injury was not the result of a duel with an Order member. It was something far more ironic. In the chaos of the battle, as spells flew and shelves of prophecy shattered, Nott was caught in the crossfire of his own side. A stray curse, perhaps from Dolohov or Roll, struck him in the back. He collapsed among the broken glass and swirling dust. A casualty of friendly fire in a war that demanded absolute precision. The Ministry took him, and for a time he sat in an Azkaban cell, his mind still sharp but his body broken. The injury left him with a permanent limp and a tremor in his wand hand. When the Death Eaters broke out of Azkaban in 1996, Nott was freed, but he was never the same. Voldemort did not tolerate weakness, and a man who could no longer cast with steady precision was a liability. The Pure Blood Directory was confiscated by the Ministry during his arrest, and without his greatest asset, Nott's influence evaporated. He returned to his estate, a diminished figure, a ghost of the intellectual titan he had once been. The Dark Lord no longer summoned him to meetings. The inner circle whispered that Nott was finished, that his best years were behind him, and in the cruel calculus of Voldemort's regime, a broken tool was simply discarded. But Nott had one final piece of influence left: his son, Theodore. Theodore Nott was a Slytherin, quiet and observant, much like his father had been in his youth. He watched the war unfold from the common room of Hogwarts, saw the Carrows terrorize the corridors, and witnessed the rise and fall of his father's fortunes. Unlike Crabbe and Goyle, who followed their fathers into blind obedience, Theodore had inherited his father's intellect. He understood that the Death Eater path was not one of glory, but of servitude. He saw what it had done to his father, broken, discarded, and forgotten. When the final battle came, Theodore Nott did not fight. He did not raise his wand for the Dark Lord. He chose survival, not out of cowardice, but out of a cold, calculating understanding that the war was already lost. He had seen the Pure Blood Directory, had read the names and the histories, and he knew that blood alone could not sustain a movement built on fear. The legacy his father left him was not a call to arms, but a warning. Theodore Nott walked away from the Death Eater legacy. He did not join the Order, did not seek redemption. He simply disappeared into the quiet life of a scholar, preserving the knowledge of his family without the poison of its politics. He was the rejection of everything his father had stood for, a silent testament that even the darkest bloodlines could choose a different path. And as the war ended and the dark marks faded to scars, the Nott name survived, not through loyalty to a fallen Dark Lord, but through the quiet wisdom of a son who knew that some legacies are meant to be broken. But not every follower of Voldemort was bound by blood or intellect. Some were driven by something far more primal, far more savage, and in the shadows of the war, there lurked a creature who was never truly a Death Eater, but who was used by them all the same. His name was Fenrir Greyback, and he was the outcast enforcer, the monster Voldemort kept on a leash. What happened to him when the leash finally snapped? That is a story for our next chapter. While Nott the Elder nursed his wounds and watched his influence drain away, in the wake of the Department of Mysteries disaster, another figure on Voldemort's side was rising in a very different way. This was not a pure-blood patriarch with a vault of gold and a seat on the Wizengamot. This was a man who had been cast out of wizarding society long before he ever joined the Death Eaters. Indeed, He had never truly been invited in. Fenrir Greyback did not care about blood status in the way that the Malfoys and the Knots did. He did not crave a place at the minister's table or a quiet estate in the countryside. What he wanted was simpler, more primal, and far more terrifying. He wanted to tear down the walls that separated the magical world into two halves, the human half and the werewolf half, and he wanted to do it with teeth and claws. Greyback was not a typical Death Eater, and Voldemort never gave him the dark mark. That might seem strange at first, given that Greyback's loyalty to the cause was absolute and his brutality was legendary. But the dark mark was a brand of belonging, a mark of trust reserved for the inner circle, those whom Voldemort considered worthy of bearing his symbol. Fenrir Greyback, for all his usefulness, was never considered worthy. He was a tool, a weapon to be aimed at the enemy and then discarded when the battle was over. The Dark Lord saw werewolves as lower than humans, and he saw Greyback as the most dangerous of that lower breed. To give him the mark would have been to elevate him, to acknowledge him as something more than a beast. And Voldemort, who valued purity above all else, could never bring himself to do that. Greyback understood this, and he did not care. His loyalty was not to Voldemort personally, but to the chaos the Dark Lord promised. For decades, Greyback had made it his mission to spread lycanthropy as a weapon of terror. He did not wait for the full moon to claim his victims. He attacked children, maimed them, infected them, and left them to grow up as outcasts like himself. He wanted to create an army of werewolves, a force that would one day overwhelm the wizarding world from within. Every child he turned was a small victory, a blow against the society that had branded him a monster. One of his most infamous attacks came during the summer before Harry Potter's 6th year at Hogwarts. Greyback accompanied a group of Death Eaters to the Burrow, the home of the Weasley family, during a raid orchestrated by Bellatrix Lestrange and her sister Narcissa. The target was Harry himself, but Greyback was not there for the boy who lived. He was there to cause as much suffering as possible. When the battle erupted, he cornered Bill Weasley, the eldest son of the family, and slashed him across the face with his claws. Bill survived, but the damage was permanent. The scars were deep and even more devastating. Greyback had attacked in his human form. That meant Bill was not turned into a werewolf, but he was cursed with a partial transformation. He developed a taste for raw meat. His appearance grew more wolfish, and he carried the psychological burden of knowing that Greyback's bite had marked him forever. That attack on Bill Weasley was not just an act of violence, it was a message. Greyback wanted the wizarding world to know that no one was safe, not even in their own homes, not even at a wedding. He wanted to spread fear so deep that families would turn against one another, that parents would look at their own scarred children and wonder if they had become something dangerous, and he succeeded to a degree. For years after the attack, Bill Weasley lived with the stigma, the whispers, the worried glances from people who did not understand the difference between a werewolf and someone who had been mauled by one. As the Second Wizarding War reached its peak, Greyback became a fixture of Voldemort's army. He was given command over the werewolf packs that fought for the Dark Lord, and he used that position to indulge his bloodlust freely. He was present at the Battle of Hogwarts, leading a contingent of snarling, half-human creatures through the broken walls of the castle. He did not fight for ideology or for power. He fought for the sheer joy of the hunt. But the hunt ended for Greyback in the chaos of the final battle. He cornered a group of students and defenders in the courtyard, and among them were Ron Weasley, Bill's younger brother, and Neville Longbottom. Ron saw the monster who had scarred his brother, who had haunted his family for years, and he did not hesitate. Together with Neville, he fought Greyback with a ferocity that matched the werewolf's own. They drove him back, knocked him down, and finally subdued him with a stunning spell. Greyback lay defeated, his reign of predatory violence finally over. He was not killed in that moment, but his power was broken. Later accounts suggest he was captured and imprisoned, a toothless predator in a cage. Fenrir Greyback was never a Death Eater in the strictest sense. He never bore the mark, never knelt in the circle, never called the Dark Lord Master with the same reverence as the others. But he was just as dangerous, perhaps more so, because he had nothing left to lose. He was an outcast who turned his curse into a weapon, and he used it to terrorize an entire generation. His story is a reminder that the darkest monsters in the wizarding world are not always the ones with the dark mark on their arm. And that brings us to another figure who lived in the shadow of the Dark Lord, a man whose name was almost erased from history, whose loyalty was misunderstood for decades, and whose sacrifice changed everything. That story begins with a locket, a house elf, and a secret that only the deepest of hearts could keep. We ended the last chapter with Fenrir Greyback, a monster who was never given the dark mark, despite all his savagery. But among those who did bear the mark, who stood closest to the Dark Lord in the First War, there was one who turned his back on everything he had been raised to believe. His name was Regulus Black, and his story is one of the most tragic and quietly heroic in the entire conflict. Regulus was the younger brother of Sirius Black, born into the most fanatically pure blood family in wizarding Britain. While Sirius rebelled and ran away to live with the Potters, Regulus stayed. He absorbed his parents' beliefs, became a Slytherin prefect at Hogwarts, and eventually accepted the Dark Mark. For a time, he was a model Death Eater, loyal, eager and proud. But the short-lived career of Sirius's brother took a sharp turn when he learned the true nature of the wizard he had sworn to serve. The moment of revelation came when Voldemort asked to borrow Kreacher, the Black family's house elf. Voldemort needed a test subject for a secret hiding place, and he took Kreacher to a cave by the sea. There, he forced the elf to drink a potion that caused unimaginable agony, then left him alone among the dead bodies floating in the water. Kreacher only survived because he was able to disapparate from the Inferi, returning to his mistress in pain but alive. When Regulus heard what had been done to his faithful elf, something inside him shattered. He realized that Voldemort did not see anyone as a true follower, not even his most devoted servants. We were all disposable tools, and Regulus understood that the Dark Lord was creating Horcruxes, objects that held pieces of his soul. The locket that Voldemort had hidden in that cave was one of them. Regulus decided to steal it, to destroy it, and to die trying. He planned the theft with Kreacher's help. He wrote and pinned it to the locket, signing it with his initials, R.A.B. Then he and Kreacher returned to the cave. Regulus made the elf force him to drink the entire basin of the potion, knowing it would kill him. While he was writhing in agony, Kreacher swapped the real locket for a fake one. When Regulus was finally conscious enough to command, he ordered Kreacher to take the locket and destroy it, and then to leave him. The Inferi rose from the black water and dragged the young Death Eater down into the depths. His sacrifice remained a secret for decades until the trio uncovered the truth of R.A.B. during their search for Horcruxes. They found the note is inside the locket, and Kreacher, still loyal to his master's memory, told them everything. Regulus Black died alone, in the dark, with no one but monsters to witness his courage. He was barely 18 years old. His family never knew what he had done. They believed he simply died, trying to desert the Dark Lord. But the truth is far more remarkable. A boy raised on pure blood supremacy, who once wore the Dark Mark with pride, found the strength to reject it. He gave his life to wound the very monster he had helped create. Now, there are other Death Eaters, whose fates are far less certain, who simply vanished from the records without a trace. Two of them, Jugson and Gibbon, appeared in the heat of battle and then disappeared into shadow. Their story is next. We left Regulus Black in the cold, dark waters of the cave, his body dragged under by Inferi after he had swapped the locket Horcrux for a fake. He died alone, knowing he had betrayed the most dangerous wizard in the world, and that his sacrifice might one day count for something. Regulus was a Death Eater who chose to disappear from Voldemort's service on his own terms. But not every follower who vanished made that choice. Some simply faded into the gaps of history, their names barely whispered, their fates uncertain. Tonight, we track the lesser-known followers who vanished during the chaos of the major battles, starting with two men whose stories are as murky as the inferi-filled lake. Jugson. That name appears only in the blur of the Department of Mysteries battle. He was one of the 12 Death Eaters who answered Voldemort's summons to retrieve the prophecy. In the Hall of the Time Room, he fought alongside Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange, and Antonin Dolohov. When the Order of the Phoenix arrived, the battle turned. Dumbledore's forces overwhelmed them, and most of the attackers were captured and sent to Azkaban. But Jugson's name never reappears in the prison records. He was not among those rounded up after the battle. Was he stunned and then escaped? Did he slip away in the confusion of the exploding glass orbs? The books offer no clear answer. He simply vanishes from the narrative. Some fans speculate he might have been killed in the chaos, but no body is mentioned. Others believe he was one of the few who fled before the Aurors arrived. The ambiguity of Jugson's fate after the Department of Mysteries leaves him as one of the true missing Death Eaters, a ghost in the Dark Lord's army, unaccounted for. Then there is Gibbon. If Jugson's disappearance is a mystery, Gibbon's is a tragic mistake. He was part of the attack on Hogwarts during the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, when Draco Malfoy's plot to kill Dumbledore reached its climax. Gibbon's role was to raise the dark mark over the castle, a signal of Voldemort's triumph. But in the heat of the fighting, as Death Eaters and Order members clashed in the corridors, something went horribly wrong. We know that Gibbon was struck down, not by an enemy, but by his own ally. In the chaos, the Death Eater Thorfinn Roll cast a killing curse that missed its intended target and hit Gibbon instead. Gibbon's accidental death by friendly fire during the Battle of the Astronomy Tower is almost a footnote. A wizard who had pledged his life to Voldemort died by the wand of a fellow follower, his body left among the rubble while the fighting raged on. No one paused to mourn him. In the aftermath, his death was barely mentioned. Both Jugson and Gibbon represent the disposable nature of Voldemort's inner circle. The Dark Lord did not care about the lives of his followers. They were tools, and when they broke, he discarded them without a second thought. Jugson may have slipped through the cracks of history. Gibbon was erased by a misplaced curse. Their fates underscore how even the most devoted servants could vanish without a trace, their names forgotten except by those who study the war's darkest corners. And as the war wore on, the list of the disappeared grew longer. Some were captured, some fled, some died in silence. But not all who escaped justice were Death Eaters themselves. There were those who sympathized, who aided Voldemort from the shadows, who never bore the dark mark but still served his cause. The story of one such man, a father whose son played a very different role, would soon come to light in a trial that shook the Ministry. That is where we turn next, to a courtroom where loyalty, guilt, and ambition were weighed, and where the line between follower and enabler blurred beyond recognition. The silence that followed the Battle of the Astronomy Tower was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a held breath. Gibbon had fallen to his own ally's curse, and Jugson had simply vanished into the dark. One more ghost in a war that swallowed names whole. But for every Death Eater who bore the dark mark, there were twice as many who never took the brand. They funded the movement, they passed information, they provided safe houses and potions and alibis. And when the war ended, the Ministry had to decide, what do you do with a man who never raised his wand, but whose gold bought the rope that hanged the innocent? The trial of Ludo Bagman's father is a perfect case study in that impossible question. You see, the elder Bagman was never a Death Eater. He never knelt before Voldemort, never felt the searing pain of the dark mark burned into his forearm. But he was a sympathizer, a man who believed quietly and perhaps only for a time that the old ways were worth reviving. He offered funding to the cause, a steady stream of galleons that helped purchase illegal dark artifacts and bribe Ministry officials. he was not alone. There were dozens like him. Pure-blood families who kept their hands clean but their vaults open, who whispered encouragement at dinner parties while never once stepping onto a battlefield. And this is where the Ministry's nightmare began. After Voldemort's final defeat in 1998, the Aurors rounded up every marked Death Eater they could find. The trials were brutal, the sentences long, but then came the next wave, the sympathizers, men like Ludo Bagman's father. The problem was simple. How do you prove someone intended to help a terrorist organization when they never actually raised a wand in violence? The standard of evidence shifted. Memories were extracted, bank records subpoenaed, testimonies gathered from those who had turned informant. But the line between coerced help and willing partnership was a fog. Many had given in to fear. Voldemort's reign of terror made compliance a survival instinct. How do you punish a man who handed over gold because he was terrified that his family would be murdered if he refused? The trial of the elder Bagman became a public spectacle. He was a former Ministry employee, a well-connected figure in wizarding society. The Daily Prophet covered every session. His son Ludo had been a famous Quidditch player, and the family name carried weight. But the evidence was damning. Ledgers showing regular payments to known Death Eater coffers, correspondence with Avery and Knott, recorded conversations in which he referred to Muggle-borns as undesirable, and yet his defense argued he had never taken the mark. He had never attended a meeting. He had never personally harmed anyone. Was it a crime to hold prejudiced beliefs? Was it a crime to be afraid? The Wizengamot struggled. Some members wanted to make an example of him, to send a message that even financial support would be punished with life in Azkaban. Others worried that such a broad net would ensnare hundreds of families who had acted only out of terror. In the end, the elder Bagman was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to 10 years, but the verdict satisfied no one. The pure-blood families who had escaped justice saw it as persecution. The victims saw it as leniency, and the Ministry realized that the war might be over, but the social fallout had only just begun. Because here's the truth that the history books often skip. The families associated with the movement did not simply disappear after 1998. The Malfoys, the Knotts, the Parkinsons, they still lived in their manor houses. Their children still attended Hogwarts. The social fabric of the wizarding world had been torn, and you cannot repair that with a single trial. Many of those families were shunned. Their businesses failed. Their marriage alliances collapsed. Some fled abroad. Others dug in, bitter and resentful, raising a new generation that would whisper about the good old days when their fathers had power. The elder Bagman died in Azkaban after 5 years a broken man, but his son Ludo had to live with the stain, and that stain would follow the family name for decades. The Ministry never did find a clean way to separate the true believers from the coerced. The trials dragged on for years, clogging the courts, draining resources. Eventually, a sort of amnesty was declared for minor sympathizers who came forward voluntarily. But the deep wounds of the war, the mistrust between pure-blood families and the rest of the community, never healed entirely. It festered in quiet conversations and carefully written letters, in the way certain children were treated at school. And all of this was happening while the world was still reeling from the final battle. But that battle, the one that ended everything, was not fought in a courtroom. It was fought in the halls of Hogwarts, where the true measure of loyalty and courage was finally taken. The story of that final stand is one we will explore next. And it is a story that reveals just how thin the line between a sympathizer and a traitor can become when the walls are burning around you. The Ministry had been struggling for years, trying to separate the true Death Eaters from those merely caught in the snare of terror. They had seen the sympathizers, the men like Ludo Bagman's father, who passed information out of fear, not loyalty. But when the Dark Lord rose again, all pretense fell away. The coerced were either branded or discarded, and the core remained, waiting for the final command. That command came on the night of the Battle of Hogwarts, when Voldemort's army converged on the ancient school, and the siege began in earnest. Let us examine the formation of that army, not as a chaos of masks and curses, but as a military deployment. Voldemort, ever the strategist, positioned his forces with deliberate precision. The giants lumbered from the Forbidden Forest, smashing the outer walls. The Dementors hovered overhead, eager to feast on hope. But the Death Eaters themselves, the marked ones, were arranged in a tightening ring around the castle. The inner circle, led by Bellatrix Lestrange, formed the vanguard. He was the most fanatical, the most unpredictable, and Voldemort used her as a bludgeon. Behind her, the Lestranges and the Caro siblings held the flanks, tasked with suppressing any breakout from the Order. Corbin Yaxley and Thorfinn Roll commanded the second wave, ready to reinforce any breach. And in the rear, the more cautious Death Eaters, men like Lucius Malfoy, who had already lost favour, were positioned as a reserve. Perhaps to test their loyalty, perhaps to ensure they could not flee without being seen. This formation was not haphazard. Voldemort had studied the castle's defences, the Order's tactics, even the students' willingness to fight. He knew that Albus Dumbledore was dead, but he also knew that the castle itself would resist. So he sent his Death Eaters in waves, each group tasked with a specific objective: break the protective enchantments, capture the bridge, overwhelm the defenders one section at a time. But Hogwarts had secrets of its own. The statues came to life, the house elves joined the fray, and the Death Eaters found themselves fighting not just wizards, but the very stones of the school. Then came the duel in the Great Hall, when Harry Potter revealed himself, when Voldemort's own curse rebounded. Something happened that no tactical manual could prepare for. The dark marks on the arms of every living Death Eater, the mark they had worn with pride, began to burn. Not the familiar summoning burn, but a searing, agonizing heat, as if the mark itself were trying to tear itself off their skin. And then, as Voldemort's body crumpled to the floor, the burn faded into a cold, empty scar. The mark was still there, but it was dead. It no longer had power. It no longer summoned. It was just a brand, a permanent reminder of a lost cause. In that moment, the siege collapsed, not from any single spell, but from the sheer weight of defeat. The Death Eaters, who had been fighting with manic loyalty, suddenly stopped. They looked at their arms. They looked at each other. And then they looked at the body of their master, ordinary and lifeless. The first to break were the ones who had never truly believed. The Lucius Malfoys, the survivors who had only joined because it was safer than opposing. They threw down their wands. Others, like Bellatrix, fought to the last gasp, but even she was felled by a mother's fury. And then the mass surrender began. Death Eaters scattered into the darkness, only to be rounded up by the Aurors, who had survived the battle. Some tried to flee to the Forbidden Forest, but the Centaurs were waiting. Some tried to blend in with the wounded, but their branded forearms gave them away. By dawn, the majority of the surviving followers were in chains. The dark marks on their arms had become scars, faded, puckered, but still visible. They would carry those scars for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder of the night their master died. What happened next, when the Ministry had to decide the fate of every marked man and woman, would reshape the entire wizarding world. The trials that followed, and the reforms that Kingsley Shacklebolt pushed through, would determine whether the Second War had truly ended, or whether the ashes of Voldemort's reign still held a spark of rebellion. The Battle of Hogwarts was over, and the smoke had finally begun to clear. The castle stood broken but unbowed, and the bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the grounds, waiting to be honoured. But while the war had ended in a single triumphant moment, the aftermath was far more complex. The living Death Eaters did not simply vanish. Some had been captured during the final assault. Others had fled in the chaos, attempting to melt back into the shadows they had crawled out from. The Ministry, however, was a ruin. Its leadership had been decimated, and its credibility shattered. Into that void, stepped one man who understood that the reckoning after the war could be just as important as the war itself. Kingsley Shacklebolt was not merely a skilled Auror. He was a strategist with a vision for a new kind of justice, one that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Hogwarts, he moved swiftly to consolidate power. He was named acting minister for magic almost immediately, and his first priority was to overhaul the Wizengamot. The old system had been riddled with corruption, heavy with the influence of old blood families who had looked the other way or profited from the Dark Lord's rise. Kingsley knew that a fair trial was impossible if the court itself was tainted, so he replaced entrenched officials with judges who had no ties to the old regime. He introduced new protocols for evidence gathering, requiring verifiable memories and independent testimony, rather than relying on a single accused or accuser, and he made sure that the burden of proof shifted just enough to prevent the guilty from slipping through cracks that had been deliberately carved open. One of the most notorious of those cracks was the Imperius defense. For years, Death Eaters had claimed they were forced to commit atrocities under the Imperius curse. The ministry, during Cornelius Fudge's tenure, had accepted these claims far too readily, allowing many dark wizards to walk free. Kingsley ended that. He established a task force of highly trained legilimens and curse breakers who could verify whether a suspect had genuinely been controlled. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement was restructured, and the threshold for the Imperius defense was raised so high that it became nearly impossible to fake. Those who had once hidden behind it were now forced to face the consequences of their choices. Many of the surviving inner circle, men like Antonin Dolohov, Thorfinn Roll, and the Caro siblings, found themselves stripped of their last excuse. And where were they sent? Not to the Azkaban of old, with its dementors and soul-sucking despair. Kingsley recognised that the dementors themselves had been complicit in the war. Siding with Voldemort during the prison break of 1997, he could not risk leaving them in charge of the most dangerous criminals in the wizarding world. So, in one of the most controversial reforms of his term, he removed the Dementors from Azkaban entirely. The prison remained, but it was now guarded by auras, enchanted barriers, and a regimen of strict surveillance. The cells were rebuilt, the wards strengthened, and the island itself was warded against apparition and portkeys. The surviving inner circle, those who had not died in battle or been killed by their own master, were incarcerated there without hope of parole. They would live out their years in a silent, sterile fortress, cut off from magic and the outside world, but without the slow insanity of the Dementor's kiss. It was a prison of firm justice, not cruel torture, and for the wizarding public, it was a sign that the new ministry would not repeat the old one's failures. Yet not all who fought for Voldemort faced the same fate. The case of the Malfoy family sparked intense public debate and lingering bitterness. Lucius Malfoy had been a high-ranking Death Eater, his home a safe house for the Dark Lord's plots. He had supplied wealth, influence, and even his own son to the cause, and yet both he and his wife Narcissa walked free. The official reasoning was that they had turned against Voldemort in the final moments. Narcissa had lied to the Dark Lord's face to protect Harry Potter, and Lucius had fled the battle rather than fight to the death. The Wizengamot, under Kingsley's new system, accepted their testimony that they had acted under duress and eventually chose the light. But the public knew that their freedom was also a result of their wealth and connections. The Malfoys had the best lawyers, the most powerful friends, and a history of bending the law to their advantage. There was no grand trial, no scandalous verdict. They simply slipped out of the noose, and that created a simmering resentment among those who had lost loved ones to Death Eater violence, who saw the Malfoys as a symbol of the Old Order's immunity. Kingsley himself understood the controversy. He was not naive, but he also believed that a nation trying to heal could not afford to spend years chasing down every accomplice with a grudge. The goal was to secure the future, not to settle every score. The Malfoys, for all their sins, had provided crucial intelligence in the final days. Their son Draco had been effectively forced into service, and a trial that dragged on for years would only keep the wounds open. So as a matter of policy, Kingsley drew a line. The core inner circle would face the full measure of the law. Those who had genuinely defected at the last moment, who had saved lives or provided key evidence, would receive clemency. It was not a perfect system. It left a bitter taste in many mouths, but it allowed the ministry to move forward, to rebuild, to face the next challenge. And what was that next challenge? For the Death Eaters, who had survived and were now locked away, their dark marks had faded to scars. The mark that had once burned with the Dark Lord's summons, that had glowed and writhed, was now a dead brand. It held no magic, it held no loyalty, but it remained on their skin, a permanent reminder of what they had done. And for the wizarding world, the question lingered. What would happen when that scar finally faded away completely? When the last living Death Eater died in a cell, and the mark itself became nothing more than a historical curiosity? That story of the final dissolution of the Dark Lord's legacy is one we will explore in the next chapter, the fading of the mark. And so the trials ended. The cells of Azkaban, newly cleansed of Dementors, held the remnants of an army that had once terrorized Britain. But for those who walked free, or those who served their sentences and returned to a world that had moved on, there was a ghost that refused to fade. A ghost branded into their left forearms, etched into the very fabric of their skin. The dark mark was never merely ink. It was a magical brand, a curse that bound the bearer to Voldemort's will, a beacon that could summon them from across the country, a link that allowed him to feel their presence and command their loyalty. It was a living thing, pulsing with the Dark Lord's power. When he died, truly died, that final time in the Great Hall at Hogwarts, the mark died with him. But death in magic is rarely clean. The transformation was not instantaneous. As Voldemort's life ebbed away, the mark on every surviving Death Eater's arm began to burn, but not with the familiar searing summons. It was a different heat, a slow, dissolving ache, as though something deep within the symbol was unravelling. Those who were present at the battle watched the skull and serpent fade, the black lines bleaching to a sickly grey, then to a pale, fine scar that resembled a network of old veins. The colour drained away, but the shape remained, a permanent imprint, like a shadow that refuses to leave a room after the light has been extinguished. Why does it not vanish completely? The answer lies in the nature of the bond. The mark was not a simple enchantment that could be broken with a counterspell. It was a piece of Voldemort's magic, anchored to his soul. When he died, that active magic lost its source, but the brand itself was never a temporary charm. It was a scarification, a magical tattoo that fused with the bearer's own magical signature. The trace remains, like a healing wound that turns to scar tissue. The mark of a Dark Lord never truly heals, it only changes form. For those who survived and tried to reintegrate, that scar became a prison of the mind. Imagine looking down at your arm every morning and seeing a faded serpent and skull. Imagine every stranger who catches a glimpse of it in Diagon Alley. Every Auror who asks to check your left forearm during a routine identity check. The brand labels them, marks them, casts them forever as former servants of the most feared wizard in history. Even those who were never convicted, who claimed the Imperius curse, who turned informant, who fled before the war ended, carried the evidence of their allegiance etched into their bodies. The psychological burden is not just shame, it is the constant threat of rejection. It is knowing that no matter how much you try to rebuild, society will always see the scar first. Some tried to hide it. They wore long sleeves, used glamours, applied ointments that promised to fade magical tattoos, but nothing worked. The scar was part of them, tied to their own magical core. It was a permanent reminder of the darkest age in wizarding history, and of the choices they made, or were forced to make. And yet not all marks were equal. For some, like Lucius Malfoy, The faded scar became a mark of surrender, a sign that the war was over and that he had lost. For others, like Bellatrix Lestrange, the mark never had a chance to fade. Her arm turned cold with death before the transformation could complete. For the handful who escaped justice altogether, the scar remains a silent accusation, a stigma that follows them wherever they go. The wizarding world had to learn to live with these scars. Kingsley Shacklebolt's reforms did not erase them. The ministry could not issue a spell that would wipe away the past. Instead, the scars became a symbol of a divided society. Some argued that all bearers should be imprisoned for life, no matter their role. Others pointed to the few who had resisted from within, like Regulus Black, who died trying to undermine Voldemort, or Severus Snape, whose mark never lost its darkness, but whose heart had turned. The scar does not tell the story. It only records the fact of the bond. Why can the mark never truly disappear? Because magic that touches the soul leaves a residue. The dark mark was more than a tattoo. It was a vow, and vows, in the magical world, are never broken without consequence. The scar is that consequence, a permanent reminder that the Dark Age happened, that people were complicit, that the war was real and left its marks on flesh and spirit. And now, as the survivors settle into the long decades of peace, a new generation grows up in a world where their parents carry faded serpents under their sleeves. Children of Death Eaters, children of those who fought alongside Voldemort, children of those who lost everything. They inherit not the mark itself, but the legacy of its scar. What does it mean to be the son or daughter of a marked wizard? How do you live with a past you did not choose? That story, the next chapter in the long aftermath of the war, is about the scars that are passed down. The burden of a name, the weight of a symbol that never fully fades. It is a story of the next generation and the shadows they carry. The fading of the dark mark was not merely a physical event. When Voldemort fell in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, every brand on every surviving Death Eater's arm turned a dull, silvery grey, like an old scar left by a violent cut. But the scar was more than skin deep. It etched itself into the lives of their children, the next generation, who had to grow up in the shadow of a name that carried more than just a family connection. It carried the weight of terror, of betrayal, of a war that ended but never truly went away. Draco Malfoy, standing in the ruins of the manor that had once been a command centre for the Dark Lord, knew that his own son, Scorpius, would never be able to escape the Whispers. The Malfoy name had been a badge of honour in pure blood circles for centuries, but after the war, it became a synonym for cowardice and complicity. Draco himself had been forced to walk a tightrope between his father's loyalty and his own survival instinct. Now, as a father, he faced a different kind of battle. How to teach Scorpius to hold his head up when every first year at Hogwarts had heard the story of the boy who had tried to capture Harry Potter, the boy who had almost been a killer. The pure blood ideology that had fueled Voldemort's rise was not a living philosophy anymore, but it still lingered like a ghost in the corridors of the wizarding world. Families like the Knotts, the Greengrasses, and the Goyles had once believed in the inherent superiority of magical bloodlines. But after the Second Wizarding War, that belief was shattered, not just by the defeat of Voldemort, but by the cold reality of what that ideology had led to. The Malfoys, once the standard bearers of that old guard, found themselves ostracised by both sides. Lucius Malfoy, stripped of his influence and his wealth in the aftermath, spent his later years in a quiet, bitter silence. Draco chose a different path. He married Astoria Greengrass, a woman whose family had never fully embraced the Death Eater cause, and together they raised Scorpius with a gentle but firm understanding that blood purity was a lie, but the stigma did not disappear. Scorpius Malfoy, as a child, faced questions at every turn. Was he like his father? Was he like his grandfather? Did he secretly hate Muggleborns? The Whispers followed him to Hogwarts, even after the Sorting Hat placed him in Slytherin, a house that had long been associated with ambition, and, too often, with the old pure-blood elite. Yet something was shifting. In the post-war years, The very concept of blood status began to lose its power. The Ministry, under Kingsley Shacklebolt, had made it a priority to teach wizarding history honestly, to dispel the myths that had fueled the persecution of Muggle-borns. Hogwarts itself changed. The house rivalry softened, and students from Slytherin and Gryffindor began to work together in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The rare instances of reconciliation between the families of the victors and the defeated were hard-won. Harry Potter, the symbol of victory, famously refused to let the old hatreds dictate his own children's friendships. His son, Albus Severus, chose to befriend Scorpius Malfoy, breaking the cycle of enmity that had defined their father's generation. That friendship was not universally accepted. Many in the wizarding community felt that the sins of the fathers should not be so easily forgotten. But Harry believed that the future had to be built on something stronger than vengeance. He saw in Scorpius a boy who had no part in the war, who was being judged for a name he did not choose, and in that choice, a quiet but powerful message was sent. The children could choose their own paths. The price of that choice was high. Draco and Astoria Malfoy had to endure constant scrutiny. Astoria, who had always been gentle and kind, was often treated with suspicion simply because of her surname. She died young, leaving Draco to raise Scorpius alone. But before she passed, she made sure Scorpius understood that the real magic in the world was not in blood, but in the bonds you formed. Scorpius took that lesson to heart, and he found his closest friend in Albus Severus Potter, friendship that symbolized the beginning of a genuine healing. The shift in pure blood ideology was not instant, and it was not complete. Families like the Gaunts had disappeared into nothingness, but the old sentiment still had its secret followers. People who whispered in dark rooms about the old days, but the public face of the wizarding world had changed. The children who had grown up in the aftermath of war were not the same as their parents. They had seen the photographs of the Battle of Hogwarts, the memorials to the fallen, the empty places at tables where Death Eaters had once sat. They knew that the price of blind loyalty was too high. Scorpius Malfoy, the boy with the scarred name, did not have to bear the weight of his grandfather's crimes. He walked into Hogwarts each year with his head high, and he proved that a name could be rewritten. The Malfoy legacy, once a curse, became a story of survival and change. And in that quiet transformation, the scars of the past finally began to heal. The next chapter, the legacy of the 32, will explore what the Death Eaters left behind, not just in their children, but in the fabric of wizarding society itself. Some legacies are built on terror, others on sacrifice, and a few on the slender thread of redemption. What remains of those 32 names when the dark marks have faded to scars? And the next generation has already started to speak their own lines, and so the children grew up in a world where their parents' sins were etched into history. The names Malfoy, not Crabbe Goyle, once badges of pure blood supremacy, became burdens to bear, or in some cases badges of redemption. But what about the sins themselves? What about the 32 who first took the mark, who swore their lives to Lord Voldemort? Their legacy is not just a list of names on a memorial plaque. It is the final tally of a failed ideology, a body count that stretches across 2 wars and leaves a permanent scar on the wizarding world. When we talk about the 32, we are talking about a number that has become a kind of shorthand, a way to count the core, the inner circle, the ones who were truly branded, but the reality is messier. Voldemort had more than 32 followers over the decades. There were sympathizers, informants, mercenaries, and the merely terrified. The 32 are the ones who stand out in the records, the ones whose fates we can trace from the fire-lit gatherings in the Riddle house to the final battle on the Hogwarts grounds. Let us begin with the dead. Bellatrix Lestrange, the most loyal of them all, fell to Molly Weasley's curse in the Great Hall. A death that was both a victory and a tragedy, because Bellatrix had become a symbol of the madness that Voldemort's ideology cultivated. Evan Rosier died in the First Wizarding War, killed by Alistair Moody when he refused to surrender. Antonin Dolohov, a brutal killer, was finally slain in the Battle of Hogwarts. Walden Macnair, the executioner who tried to behead Buckbeak, met his end in the same battle. Thorfinn Rowell, the hulking brute, fell in the chaos. The Caro siblings, Amicus and Alecto, were captured and imprisoned after the war, but some sources suggest they died in Azkaban, and there are others, unnamed, unrecorded, whose bodies were never recovered from the rubble of the castle. Then there are the imprisoned. After the Battle of Hogwarts, Kingsley Shacklebolt's reforms ensured that the surviving Death Eaters would not escape justice again. No more Dementors to guard Azkaban. But the cells were still cold and the walls still impassable. Lucius Malfoy was sentenced to life, though his sentence was commuted after he provided crucial testimony about Voldemort's methods. But he never walked free. He spent his remaining years in a private wing of the prison, his fortune seized. His wife Narcissa, though never formally marked, was placed under house arrest for her role in harbouring fugitives. Rodolphus and Rabastan Lestrange, Bellatrix's husband and brother-in-law, were recaptured after their brief escape in the Ministry battle. They remain in Azkaban to this day, their minds long broken by the Dementor's kiss from the First War. Corbin Yaxley, the Ministry infiltrator, was caught trying to flee and died in a cell. Augustus Rookwood, the spy, tried to bargain his way out but was denied any leniency. Travers, Selwyn, Not. All were rounded up in the months after Voldemort's fall. Some died in prison. Some still live, their dark marks nothing more than faded scars that ache in the cold. And then there are those who found a way to live on. Not by fighting, but by slipping away. Igor Karkaroff, the coward, ran the moment Voldemort returned. He was found dead in a shack in the far north, killed by former Death Eaters who saw him as a traitor. Peter Pettigrew, the rat, was strangled by his own silver hand in the cellar of Malfoy Manor, a death that was almost poetic, given his decades of betrayal. Barty Crouch Jr., captured after the third task, received the Dementor's kiss and now sits as an empty shell in St. Mungo's. Severus Snape, the double agent, died by Nagini's fangs in the Shrieking Shack, but his death was not a defeat. It was the final act of a man who had spent his entire adult life atoning for a single adolescent mistake, and some, like the unnamed followers in the crowd at the Quidditch World Cup, simply vanished. They melted back into the population, their mark covered by long sleeves, never to be found. But the legacy of the 32 is not just a list of fates. It is a lesson in the failure of an ideology that promised power through blood and fear. Voldemort believed that pure blood supremacy would unite the wizarding world under his rule. Instead, it divided families, destroyed communities, and left a trail of orphans and widows. The Death Eaters themselves were not a united front. They were a collection of petty ambitions, ancient grudges, and desperate loyalties. When Voldemort fell, that coalition shattered. Some died fighting for a lost cause, some rotted in cells, some lived in shame, their children forced to navigate a world that had no room for their parents' sins. And yet the world survived. The 21st century wizarding world, as Kingsley Shacklebolt built it, is one of peace. The Ministry no longer tolerates the old pure blood rhetoric. Hogwarts teaches the dangers of extremism. The Dark Mark is a historical curiosity, a symbol that has lost its power to terrify. The children of the Death Eaters, Draco Malfoy, Scorpius and others, found their own paths, free from the shadows of the past. The last dark marks faded, and the last echoes of Voldemort's voice died away. So when we close the book on the Death Eaters, we close it on a chapter of magical history that was written in blood and fire. 32 names, 32 stories, 32 fates. Some dead, some imprisoned, some redeemed, some forgotten. But all of them part of a legacy that teaches us one thing: that the pursuit of power through fear is a dead end, that the only lasting magic is the one that builds, not destroys, and that the peace we have now was earned, not given, by the courage of those who stood against the dark, and by the quiet endurance of those who survived it. The book is closed. The wizarding world breathes free. and the 32 are nothing more than a memory. A reminder of what happens when we forget that power, like all magic, has a price. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this changed your perspective or taught you something new, consider subscribing for more mind-expanding content. And if you know someone who would find this as fascinating as you did, share it with them. These are the kind of conversations that matter.